All right, welcome everybody. We're just kind of getting all the logistics in and getting people in over from Juneau into this room. So let's just give it another couple minutes.
While we're waiting, can everybody just take a moment and introduce themselves in the chat there? Tell us where you're coming from. Tell us who you are a little bit, and maybe tell us what your goal is for this workshop. We're really excited to have you here. And Dr. Santa is going to take us through everything in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for everyone to get here. So we've had, I think, 77 people sign up. So we're going to wait for a little bit till we get a closer to majority, because I think that'll be helpful. And we're excited to have you here. It's so good. Thank you. Oh, and one more thing would be, we need you to identify yourself by your name. So if you don't know how to do that, what you got to do is go and find your name in the chat. You're going to hover over your name, and then you're going to look for the little more button. You're going to drop that down, and then you're going to rename, and you're going to put your name, please. So if you don't know how to do that, just message me and I'll walk you through again. I'll be doing this kind of vamping for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to get started. We're really excited to have you here. All right, we're up at 26 people. All right, welcome to a couple more people. We're excited. This is so cool. We've got people from all over: South Carolina, Vanderbilt, Texas, great. Long Island, excellent. We got some senior people. We've got some junior people. Hi, Kat. How's it going? Thanks for coming. This is pretty awesome. Really excited to see you all here. It's nice to see some friendly faces that I recognize.
All right. I think people will keep coming in, but I always feel like those who get here on time should probably be rewarded with an on-time start. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to just start by asking our erudite team to kind of introduce themselves just briefly. And let me just start with Wendy, then John, and then we'll go from there.
Good morning. Everyone, hi, I'm Wendy Coates. I am a senior faculty at Harbor UCLA and UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine, and really thrilled to be here today. If you love what you see here this time in this boot camp course, please consider looking into Armed Med Ed for next year. That's a cohort course that further would develop your education research skills. And turn it over to my partner in crime, John Burkhart, who's going to be doing the first session with me right now to introduce himself.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm John Burkhart. I'm a faculty member at the University of Michigan. And I think I'm kind of mid-career at this point in time, though I haven't noticed a lot of gray yet. So maybe that means I can still be late early career. Certainly my accomplishments are more towards early career in their standing. I would also give you a fair warning that if you don't like today, you probably shouldn't do ARM, because like half of us are doing that too. So if you're like, God, I really found those people really annoying, it's going to be rough for you. Maybe because we need somebody that's more serious than me, we'll have Dr. Teresa Chan introduce herself next, and I will be quiet for the next few minutes.
Hi everyone, I'm a talk show host by day. I'm just kidding. My name is Teresa Chan and I am a assistant dean of faculty development at McMaster University up here in Canada. So my commute to my living room was the most enjoyable commute I've ever had to SAEM, because usually I have to take like connecting flights and stuff to cool places in the US. I'm very glad that you have a president that knows how to get your immunizations done. I wish we could borrow him for a little while. Generally speaking, I've spent kind of like my early to now mid-career really being passionate about medical education. So I'm really excited to be here. I also help with the Armed Med Ed crew, but I also help with the Alien Faculty Incubator, Harvard Macy. I'm non-discriminate in my helping of people who want to learn about medical education and health resident education. So, and I'm super caffeinated, and I'm going to pass it over to, who's next, Sally?
Up to you, Susan.
Yeah, Susan, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Susan Promise. I am a professor of emergency medicine at Penn State in Hershey, Pennsylvania. My career has been dedicated to medical education. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training, and I'm super excited to spend the next few hours with all of you. Thanks for joining us. Sally, where do we go from here?
Let's see, Mike, and then Jamie.
Hi all, Mike Gottlieb. I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine, also director at Rush in Chicago. I'm also part of the Armed Med Ed crew, and along with T-Chan, part of the Alien Faculty Incubator crew, and excited to work with you all today. I think Jamie's up next.
Hi everybody, I'm Jamie Jordan. I'm one of the APDs at UCLA and very excited to be here, and yeah, do a lot of other things related to med ed research, including Merck and Armed, and I think it's going to be a great day. And I guess I can turn it over to Dr. Steve Psycho.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Steve Psycho. I am the Pediatric Emergency Medicine Fellowship Director at Indiana University. I'm also an Assistant Dean for Graduate Medical Education and Faculty Development. And along with several people on this group, I'm a Decision Editor for Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training. So welcome. I think, Meg, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to spend the morning with you guys. My name is Meg Wolf. I'm at the University of Michigan, the fellowship director here for our Med Ed Fellowship. And like many of the others, serve as a mentor for the ARMS Med Ed and as a decision editor for AM-ENT. And really excited to be here with you guys, and all of your things that you put in the chat are really exciting. And hopefully we're gonna touch on many of those things today. I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Thanks, Meg. Hi, I'm Nicole Diorio. Welcome, everybody. I'm a professor of emergency medicine at Virginia Commonwealth University here in Richmond. I'm also Associate Dean for Student Affairs. And in addition to my work on AEM-ENT, I'm an executive editor for Journal of Graduate Medical Education. So as with everyone on here, love reading, editing, and writing about medical education. So welcome.
Good, and I think I'm last. So I'm Sally Santon. I split a position between Virginia Commonwealth with Nicole and University of Cincinnati, and do medical education research. All right, so just talking a bit about the day, we'll be doing kind of large sessions followed by breakouts. Each of the breakouts will have a faculty facilitator or two assigned to you plus another one, so they'll be kind of bouncing back and forth. I sent everybody a Google Doc early, like an hour or two ago. If you can't get to it, it doesn't matter. It's just kind of a worksheet, and somebody in the group ought to be able to use the Google Doc. If you were not able to get there, just shoot me, hit the response and ask to get in, or just someone in the group can pull out the Google Doc. But it's a
Holly?
shared space for you all to work on. Yes.
I've made the website live for everyone, so you can get into the group that you want. So if you look at the website there, and all you have to do is find your group once you've been assigned to a group, and the group will be up in the bar when you're thrown into a breakout room. You'll be able to see what group you are, and then you can select it.
And we will figure out in a minute how to let you know what group you're in just a minute. All right, so in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and let John and Wendy take over.
After you. So we had discussed a few different ways of going forward, and we've decided that plea acting early in the morning is the best way to go forward. So I'm going to start. I'm method, so I have to get in my face, and I'll wait for Wendy to be ready to start our little play in one act. Oof, that's a bad look.
Wait, what? You really, you just can't talk to me like that at this hour of the morning. I mean, you're already 10 minutes late for taking over our shift. It was a horrible night.
Oh, I am real sorry about that. I have just, it's hard to get back after being on vacation. I have been just, re-energized. I got immunized. I went to Fiji. I've just been laying on the beach. It has been great. It just was hard to roll out of bed this morning because, I missed the ocean and the sand, and I'm sorry that you had a bad shift, but I just am so glad to be back here, and but
this is my 7th night in a row.
Well, then you should be all set. Your circadian rhythm's all set. I mean, that's where you hit the sweet spot. 7 in a row on nights. That's really, I love that. That's my favorite shift of the year. What made it bad? I mean, was it too slow and boring? Because I sometimes that's what I find.
Okay, so did they just not have COVID in Fiji or something?
No, just cocktails based on coconuts. What's the big deal with that? I mean, it's I remember the coronavirus. That's not a big deal.
Okay, just take a chill pill. I mean, it's just giving me a headache to hear how excited you are and alive and awake, and all I want to do is go to sleep. I have had the worst possible night. Do you know that there were 11 COVID patients here last night, and every single one of them needed to get intubated? And I just don't even know what is going on with our residents, like the junior residents, the senior residents. Nobody knows what is supposed to happen during this serious intubation, like all these procedures. It's terrible. The seniors don't even know how to put on their PPE, and they walk in and they contaminate themselves. And then I'm going to go home and I'm not even going to be able to go to sleep because I'm going to be worried that they're all going to be catching COVID under my watch. It is just so frustrating. I mean, we've taught them. I just don't even know what else we can do.
So what's the big deal? I mean, you put the tube in the hole, the right one. There's 2, right? And you wear a trash bag. I mean, maybe we should do some research on this, because I don't see why this is so hard. We could maybe we could randomize half the residents to getting PPE and half not, and we can see if they're actually going to get sick or not. Or maybe we could do something. I don't know. What is that? You're a researcher, right? I had my annual review before I left for Fiji, and the chair was really telling me I got to do some scholarly work. And med ed seems easy. So why don't you and I do something together here, real easy?
Trash bags.
Well, I mean,
Are you
that's
serious?
What the CDC said, right?
Well, that's what the CDC used to say, but I think that the CDC has been reformed. of late. And I think trash bags are out and PPE is in. Fortunately, we have enough supply, except I'm so worried that they're going to go through 3 sets of PPE to just get it on there one time. Oh, and then, you know, it was kind of like this circus, because then they'd have the PPE, then their face shield would be all fogged up and they couldn't see, they couldn't use any of the equipment because they felt too constricted. And some of them even just took off the PPE and said that they were young and they wouldn't get COVID because they're so young. So, you know, what do you propose? I mean, it would be great if we could just meet and talk about this later in detail, but let's just kind of go over the
let's knock it out
skeleton.
now. Today is the day. Seize the day. Let's do it right this second. I feel like there's some
Okay,
good
how long is
energy
this
on
going to
this.
take?
So
Yeah.
so if we're not going to randomize them to maybe get PPE or not, how about I mean, you said it was hard for them to get it on and then they had a hard time doing it. I mean, I guess that's something we could try and teach them about. Well, why
Yeah,
don't we?
but see, here's the thing about these people. Like, when we have spent all this time in the simulation center teaching them how to intubate, and every single one of them is able to do it flawlessly, especially the seniors. And then after the sessions, even the juniors can do it on a mannequin. And even when we did the team training and there was a lot of hustle and bustle in the sim center, they were still able to intubate. I don't know what it is about COVID and PPE that makes them suddenly inept.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting idea. What is it? Is there a way we could figure that out? I mean, I don't know. Again, you know, you're the
Yeah, well,
scholar.
we certainly,
I'm
it's
just,
not ethical. It's not ethical for us to have some of them have PP and not. So, like, we have to make sure that there's an
how about
ethical
instead
component.
we can randomize them to teaching them how to use PPE, and some of them don't teach them how to do PPE. Would that work?
Oh, you mean just
I mean, that's not. I mean, is that
about like
ethical?
they come into a shift like that, or are you talking about in a simulator?
Well, so some people we would take some people to the sim center and we teach them how to intubate with the PPE, and then the other half we just wouldn't do anything, and we'd see like maybe they'll figure it out or not, and then I don't know, we can see if who gets sick. That's a good outcome, right?
You know, well, there we go again with the ethics. I mean, it's an interesting idea, and certainly it's feasible to do it in the simulation center, but I really have to circle back to the ethical component of this. We actually really need to make sure that everyone knows how to don their PPE and doff it too, because after all, those germs are all over their PPE. We just, you know, we don't want them to take it off in the room while they're still bagging the patient, waiting for respiratory to tape in the tube and all those things that I've seen them do overnight. It's definitely relevant. So we have a feasible problem, a feasible solution here where we can do this in the simulation center. It is really interesting for us to think of a way that we can help them, because I know I would have had a much better night if I didn't have to go rescuing all these people who were suddenly unable to do the things I know they can do. So yeah, this is kind of a novel idea. I really like the idea of let's get them in the simulator and teach them how to actually do the procedure while they have the PPE on. And you know, I'm just a little bit worried because like our seniors are just so good at intubation already that I'm not sure that they'd be all in with going and learning how to intubate. They'd think that we didn't trust them.
Yeah,
So
but
how
like,
about if we pick?
but if we did seniors, then everyone would do good, and that would show that our program works good, right? That's how you want to do this. You want to set it up so that everyone succeeds, and then you look great. I mean, that's how you teach, right? You take the people that know everything, and then you say you teach them something, and then you just say that the thing that they already knew you taught them, and then you get promoted. Done.
Yeah, no. We're not going to do it that way because we have to have scientific integrity And oh my, Fiji, what kind of stuff was in that drink?
Yeah, well, I want to get back to Fiji sooner rather than later. So, if you could,
all
if
right,
you
well,
could
I
figure this
think that
out,
what we're
I got a shift to get going here. I mean, I don't know. You got this, right?
Yeah,
Just put me as a
I think
co-author.
what's going to have to happen here is that we're going to have to take these people and we're going to have to just randomize them so that they all get the training. But some of them are just going to get trained. Oh, I got it. Let's get them all trained in how to put on the PPE, because that's part of their orientation for their R2 year anyway. Okay, so they're all going to learn how to put on their PPE, because that way I'll feel better. I'm not going to have to worry about putting people at risk, and they're all going to put on their PPE. That we know that they know how to do it, and it's pretty much the same as the baseline of what we have now. So that's kind of like, assuring that everybody is safe. It's an ethical way of going about this. And then we can divide the groups in two. How about that? And one of the groups is going to be able to go to the session, and they're going to get trained in the actual process of a high stress intubation with PPE in place. And we can have people there helping them figure out how to maneuver, how to deal with sweating like a pig, all that other stuff that happens whenever you're doing this procedure. And then we can observe them in the emergency department. I think that would be a great outcome. And I think journals would be really interested because, first of all, patients would be getting intubated more quickly. And second of all, residents wouldn't be getting sick and catching COVID, especially those who have chosen not to get vaccinated. What do you think?
I think that's cool. And most importantly, it'll help me get promoted. So I'm all in. Let's do it. But come on, we got to get signed out because I need to get started. I need to get a coffee, and I just don't. My day doesn't start well if I don't have a few minutes of mindfulness during the beginning of my shift. And so I really can't spend more time talking with you. Let's sign you out, and we'll get going.
All right, that sounds great. I'm so excited. We have a finer question right now that we can do our study, and we can have a whole lot of different outcomes. Have you ever heard of the Kirkpatrick framework? It's a conceptual framework for outcomes in medical education research.
No, I'm Clan Ross from the Highlands, and I like a good Oban for a Scotch. Sometimes I like a little more peaty, but Kirkpatrick, I haven't heard of that before. No.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to send you to get a kilt and grab a book that talks all about the Kirkpatrick levels. Okay, so like, are we going to do a study that they simply like? Hey, how did you like the session we gave you in the simulator?
That sounds great. And we can give them candy so that their scores are high. And then that'll be good. That will show good education because they'll have candy. That's good. Maybe Mai Tais. I found I really like Mai Tais in the last couple of weeks.
Hey, have you met Dr. Promise? She's the editor of AEM ENT.
No.
Yeah, have you met her?
No.
Because you know what? I can see her right now in her little
square,
candy? And she is laughing at you.
She likes Mai Tais. I think this is a win.
She probably does like Mai Tais, but she does not like Kirkpatrick level 1.
Oh,
but maybe
it's number 1. It's the best. We're number 1.
Number 2. We're number 2.
I don't like being called number
harder.
2. A lot of people call me number 2 when I show up late for shifts.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. And I'm about to call you number 3 or worse right now.
Okay.
But how about level 2, where we just find out if they learned anything? We could give them a pre-test or a post-test.
Well, isn't teaching about learning? I mean, that sounds good. They learn something, and then
I think that's exactly
and then the test is done.
Level.
And tests tell us everything, right? If you do good on a test, it means you're good at everything. And we can give them. We'll just give them like a multiple choice test. And we'll have them fill out like, do you intubate into the esophagus? Yes, no. And then candy, and then science, and then Professor Burkhardt. Great. This is great. I'm so glad that we're talking.
Okay. That sounds really interesting, like a really great perspective. But, you know, maybe what we could do is we could also measure whether they have any kind of change in their behavior. Like, is there anything that they do differently after
Like, are they nicer to me?
after
That'd be
this?
good. Sometimes
Yeah,
they're not
yeah,
nice to me.
yeah,
They
yeah.
say I don't
Like
know what I'm
now, what
doing.
that I would say that that's probably sort of a given here, especially with how things are going and like yeah, anyway, but we can see if the way that they put on their PPE has changed. And we can compare that to the group who just learned PPE, and we can see if they're able to walk around the intubation situation in a better way.
Well, and like other
But you know
behaviors,
what?
maybe we could look at like, do they put more sugar in their coffee? Or do they drive faster? Those are other behavior changes we could see if that happens.
Yeah. Well, remember how I told you
You do
that
the big
we
sugar
had a
like tsunami.
we had a fine research question going here. It was
Oh yeah,
feasible, it was interesting, novel, and ethical. But I am going to tell
that
you,
last
we
one
need
doesn't
a
matter though.
finer one. It needs also to be relevant.
Oh,
Okay. And I think what we ought to do is we ought to go for the highest Kirkpatrick level, and we ought to just see if patient outcomes improve as a result of this into this intervention, and then
oh
we can just publish it in, you know, any journal that we want, and it'll just be great. What do
yeah.
you think?
I know somebody in the department that can help with us on that because I let's be frozen.
Oh good, he's frozen. No more crazy ideas.
Oh, yeah, I'm back. Good. I have one last crazy idea. So
Ah,
there's a statistician who's helped the chair. So what they would do is they would look to see patient outcomes, and they were able to show using the stat stuff that every patient I taught or took care of did worse. And so we probably can use that guy to do the stats for us to see if our thing is different, right? They could go back and look instead of like, did I take care of that patient? They could be like, did we teach them this thing? And that would work. That would work good. I'm really excited. All right, let's do it.
yay, let's do it. Hey, we are going to break character right now.
I
You
thought we
guys
hadn't
have your
started.
work. Oh, well, some of us. We have for you a workbook that you should have received that has all of the things we just talked about, framing a good research question that needs to be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. That's called a finer research question. And those are the things that you need to make sure you have each time you have an idea in mind. And hopefully our little charade here has helped you understand maybe a thought process and a way for people to move forward with a research project. And John, you want to just in like a couple of seconds just review the Kirkpatrick levels before we send them into breakout to come up with a question?
Sure. So as we brought up, there are different levels to Kirkpatrick. And actually, the one thing I would say is it's not that one is terrible. It's that one is actually, if you look at behavioral change literature, is actually really important. It just isn't usually insufficient. So we want to know if people are going to engage in this space, and if they hate it, they're less likely to continue with those behaviors. So level one is usually attitudinal change. It's about, did I like it? Did I feel like I learned something? How did I internalize the lesson? Level two is usually about learning, and that often can be in many different forms of learner assessment, which we'll get into later. Level three is looking at behavior change. So kind of translating from bench to clinic. Do they take what they've learned in the abstract and apply it in how they change, how they take care of patients, or how they change, how they take care of the world, or how they drive, or whatever behavior change you're looking to understand. And then level four is this more systemic change where you're looking at outcomes that are translational, like patient care outcomes, like we described with successful intubations. Another one could be COVID rates, contamination rates, things that are kind of end outcomes, or at least that's how I think about it. So,
Cool. We're going to turn it back over to the talk show hosts so that they can tell you how we're going to proceed from here. And you will each have a facilitator in your room. If you have any questions about the Finer method and the Kirkpatrick levels for the conceptual frameworks, then your group leaders will be able to help guide you through that as you contemplate a research question. And don't worry if your question today isn't the perfect one. I mean, clearly it takes Mai Tais in coconut halves in Fiji to come up with a really fine research question.
All right. Sally, do you want to take us through what the next step is going to be while I...
Yeah, so we're going to put you out into breakout rooms, and you'll have one or two of our current faculty with you. I think specifically we'd like you to introduce yourselves and then start kind of brainstorming or thinking about a research question and making sure that you put it in kind of finer criteria. And we will do this breakout for maybe 15 minutes or let's do 20 minutes because we're going to do introductions during this time as well. And so it'll give you a chance to kind of meet each other as well as start to begin to flesh out kind of a research question that you might be interested in.
Now, welcome for everyone who's watching on the recording. We'll be posting this on eCurriculum. So just know that if you don't feel comfortable asking a personal question with it being recorded, you can always follow up with me, or I'm guessing any of the panelists too. So why don't I stop talking and maybe our three M4s could give us a little introduction. And thank you again for agreeing to do this.
I guess I can just introduce myself really quickly. Hi, I'm Maria. I'm from North Carolina originally, and I am going into neurology.
Hi, I'm Malika. I'm from Richmond originally, and I'm going into internal medicine.
And hi, everyone. My name's Gurgis. I'm from Richmond, and I'm going into psychiatry.
So maybe folks, so here, I'll watch the chat. So if any of the M3s want to just ask out loud questions or type questions, I can keep an eye on that. But maybe to sort of be a little more of an icebreaker, each of you three could give us a little more of the background of what you were torn between, or how did it all evolve? I think that would be really helpful.
Sure. So when it came down to it, I was stuck between two fields. I was stuck between psychiatry and neurology. I actually came into med school being pretty gung-ho about going into psychiatry. I thought, there's no other field that I'm going to like. I had really strong opinions about other fields. I knew I would never do surgery. I would never do X, Y, and Z. But over time, when I got into my third year, I really enjoyed my neurology rotation overall. And so then when I thought, oh, I'll probably do neurology. And then I went to my psych rotation and I ended up loving it as well. And so then I was pretty confused at that point because I liked them both pretty equally. So when I had finally chosen my field, it was actually pretty late in the process. I ended up choosing August and I hadn't even finished both of my AIs yet. But that's just like the short end of the short story of how I ended up what I ended up choosing. But I'm more than happy to answer any questions about how I got to that point.
Yeah, hi. So for me, I was between internal medicine and OBGYN, and I kind of went into medical school interested in both of those fields. And then as kind of the preclinical years went on, I found myself between those. And then during my third year, I had internal medicine before OB, and I was kind of conflicted because I really didn't like general wards as much as I thought I would. But then I went on, so since it's 2 months, my second month was a subspecialty and I really liked that. So I was pretty confused. And then I did my OB rotation really liked it, but was kind of conflicted about the surgical part. So I decided to do AIs in both of those. And I finished my last AI about a month before applications were due. So I made my final decision for internal medicine less than a month before applications, and it was still enough time to kind of get everything in. So, I mean, my advice is to do the AIs that you need to do to get your exposure, and don't limit yourself, because it seems like there's not that much time, but you do have that time to explore, and it's better to go in without any regrets. So again, that's the short version of mine as well.
Yeah. And so I was kind of just like, I was open through to anything basically during third year. There's a couple of things that like I kind of knew I didn't want to do. But towards the end, I was essentially deciding between somehow radiology, psychiatry, and IM, which are like, it's all over the place. And the hard part for me is, so my last rotation, which we were pulled out of, was psych. So I had to like do some decision making without doing, knowing that my M4 radiology rotation and my M3 psych rotation were cut short or gone. So I ultimately decided, like, as we came back to clinicals and did my psych AI, which sort of replaced my M3 experience, I guess, and made the decision then. But there's sort of like a lot more thought that went to it than just that. So of course, feel free if you have any other questions.
We have a question in the chat for Maria.
Okay, any tips on scheduling your M4 AIs and getting that? Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say that I think however you end up scheduling it, it's okay. Like if you end up not, so what happened originally is I had signed up for my neurology AI like very early on in May, and then I was going to do a consult liaison psych after that, and then child psych AI after that. Unfortunately, the pandemic kind of threw all of my plans, out of the way, and I ended up only having a child psych AI for a really long time, which kind of stressed me out a lot. And my neurology AI was in September, and I was concerned because if I ended up choosing neurology, that was so late in the process to get a letter of recommendation that I was really nervous. At the time, I already had one letter of recommendation from neurology from someone that I knew really well, that like regardless of what field I was going into was willing to write me a letter of recommendation, which was really helpful. But I think what you'll find in whatever field you go into, when you're an AI, I found that everyone was incredibly supportive and helpful in getting what I needed to write my application. I talked to every attending, in the 4 weeks that I was on my AI about, what I needed to do to get my application. They were like, if you need anything, we'll help you out. And so I did get a letter of recommendation from my rotation. They let us do a little bit of outpatient while I was on my neurology rotation. Dr. Zukas is really helpful with, setting up your AI, and she'll help you get rotations that you think would be beneficial for you. So I talked to her a lot about setting up specific rotations that I thought would be beneficial, like to work with different people. And then I also, if you're interested in neurology, the chair and the program director are really involved with the fourth year medical students. So the second that we were interested in neurology, they actually contacted us, and we met with both of them, each as a group and individually. And so they were also willing to help write letters and get connections. So I wouldn't worry, but if those are several avenues that you can get letters of rec even very late into the process.
Lacey has a question in the chat. I will read this out loud in case the chat isn't preserved for the recording. Do you all feel like your AIs were sufficient to make your decision, or did you turn to any other resources to help in your decision making?
I can start. So personally, I do feel like that they were really helpful. I think that the transition from M3 to M4 is, pretty significant after you have had a whole year. During third year, I kind of always felt like I didn't know what was going on because you're constantly shifting, but the AI is 4 weeks. And so, you already have a little bit more confidence and you kind of know what's going on a little bit more. So I actually found them very helpful. And then I also, you have a lot of time to take electives that you choose. So I did a lot of random internal medicine electives to kind of build on the AI, but in my opinion, I think that they were helpful. But other resources in general, the specialty advisors are really great, like Dr. Rigby for OB, and then there's so many internal medicine advisors you can turn to. And, you know, I was very open and honest, and I admitted that I wasn't sure what specialty was for me, and I felt like they didn't really judge at all. They were really open and really great about giving advice.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, so I decided, like, I committed to psych once I did my AI. And, you know, I had a week of CL psych before we got pulled, and that wasn't helping me figure out if that was enough for me or not. It really was the AI that confirmed that for me. I think the other big thing, my advisors were also really helpful. I talked to Dr. Woolabin as well as a psych and radiology advisor just to sort of figure out what's best for me. But the last thing is, like, I talked to residents in those fields to kind of like figure out why they went into it and if that like matched up with their expectations. Because I think, you know, the experience you get in med school is like it's a sliver of what you actually do. So trying to gauge whether your expectations of it is what you're going to get is really important.
Yeah, I thought the AIs were sufficient, but I will say that I actually didn't finish. I didn't get to do one of my AIs before I actually made my choice. It was actually, so I did my psych AI, and then I had my step month, and then I had my neurology AI. And my psych AI was sufficient enough for me to say that I probably didn't want to do psych. So I kind of was like 90% sure that I was going to go in neurology. I had kind of made the choice before I even did the rotation. And then the rotation kind of just solidified that, yeah, that was what I was looking for. And I agree that talking to the residents in particular was really helpful for me, because yeah, they have that experience of like immediately they're still super immersed in the process of getting into residency, being a resident, like what is it like to be in neurology today. And then some attendings I actually talked to as well, and they were helpful in just telling me the reality of the field. Like sometimes like I think I was idealizing some like both of the fields in my head, like, oh, this is great for this reason. And like, I was like, oh, I loved psych because I can do this, this, and this. And they're like, well, in reality, you may not actually do that. You may not be able to do this and that. So it was, even if it was like a harsh reality, it was helpful to know. So I think talking to people was the most helpful. But I also like, I was a big list maker. So I would look at like the pros and cons of both. And I wanted to see like, could I get, you know, the pros of one field in the other field? Like, what did I like about each field? And could I get that same fulfillment from both, or sorry, from one field?
If I can add on, I would just say, in watching sort of like a lot of students' journeys, I think the natural, like concrete thinkers of us tendency is like, okay, I need to do XYZ experiences in each of these fields. And then at the end of those 8 weeks, then I will make my decision. But I think what I'm hearing glimmers up from each of you is that even as you're finishing your M3 rotations, you're kind of crystallizing what it is you do and don't want out of a specialty, so that even if you're not like really doing it in the moment, you might be gathering more evidence either for or against certain fields, even if you're not even in that rotation. So.
Yeah, I think just to like comment on that. So when the first rotation we came back after the pandemic, like when we were pulled out, was my psych AI, and I was really afraid going into it that I wasn't gonna like it and I wasn't gonna know what I was gonna do afterwards, because I didn't have even a radiology or a medicine rotation like lined up at that point. It was all really up in the air, and I was just like checking the M4 add drop constantly to figure that out. And I guess it was sort of, I was like lucky enough that after the first like 2 weeks of that rotation, I was like, okay, it doesn't matter if I do the radiology rotation. Like I know I want to do this. So it was a lot, you know, there's this ruling out that you kind of do, but there's also a ruling in. You sort of have to balance those two types of things, those two things.
Mm-hmm. So Lydia in the chat is curious if you're still considering even 3 or more specialties to at least try to get to 2.
I guess I would say, I mean, how are they very different specialties? You know, are they 3 surgical ones, or, you know, internal medicine, psychiatry, and OB. I think I would say try to find the similarities between them. For example, like in internal medicine, you can do a lot of women's health, and family medicine, you can do some psychiatry. So I would kind of see what the commonalities are between them. And then, I mean, try to get AIs in at least 2 of them, but I really do think that 4th year, it just seems stressful because it seems like you're on this huge time crunch, but I do think that you have time to explore all of those specialties, even if one of them is not necessarily an AI. There's a lot of elective time. And if you talk to those advisors, if you can't fit something in your schedule, I feel like they should be able to help you find some clinical experience to help you decide if they're vastly different. But if they're kind of similar, try to find the commonalities and kind of go from there. Is I guess my advice. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add.
Oh, Burgess, you can go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, I was just gonna say, like, I mean, it's definitely challenging because it's sort of like, what about all these 3 things is drawing you to it? And like, I can completely relate to that. Like, what on earth was drawing me to radiology and psych at the same time? It doesn't make any sense. And part of what helped me narrow things down was that there's a sort of almost a gut feeling that comes to it. It's just like when you make these, like, you think about them and you try and think about it super objectively, like ultimately you probably enjoyed one thing more than the other, at least a little bit. And so just if you see something like feel something that you just didn't have as good of a time doing, sometimes that should just be enough if you feel like you're thinking about too many things at once.
Yeah, so some of the advice that I got along like my M3 trail that I think helped, even though I kind of knew what kind of field I knew I would or wouldn't be interested in, was obviously the big divide versus medicine, surgery, or a little mix of both. So I think figuring out, do you want a mix of both? I think that would be helpful because that kind of cancels out a good amount of fields, like if you can pick one of those 3 categories. But I was also told, you may have like an awesome experience in a rotation, but you really want to take the time to think about, if you were to do this field for the rest of your life, and let's say you weren't able to subspecialize in that field, like you were just doing, like, for example, like general internal medicine, like you were a hospitalist, do you like the bread and butter of like what goes on in that field? Like what you see on a general basis, like, do you enjoy? So for me, like in psych, I really enjoyed like the general treatment of like depression, bipolar, like all of those things. Neurology, I liked, headache management, epilepsy, seizures, cancer, all of those things. So I found like that was a reassurance to me that I had kind of narrowed down correctly. I'll give an example, like on my 3rd year rotation, one of my absolute favorite rotations was ENT surgery. I absolutely loved my experience, like from start to finish. I would never do ENT surgery. Like for a second, it made me rethink, like, did I have like my thought process wrong? And then when I rethought, do I like the bread and butter of what the field is? I like that kind of helped me refocus and be like, okay, I think I had my thought process right in the first place. So keep that in mind. Your favorite rotation, that instinct you have may align with, that bread and butter. Do you like the 90%? But also make sure to kind of have a little bit of objectivity would be my advice. You need a little bit of both, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess it's a sort of a caveat to what I said. And one of the things that people really say a lot that I don't know how I feel about is that they're like, think about the people you worked with and whether you relate to them a lot. And I think that's a really challenging thing because I really liked and got along well with the people I worked with in urology, and it somehow convinced me that I should do that. And then I thought about it, I was like, there is no way I'm going to be a urologist. There's nothing about this I enjoy. But the people were so wonderful that I worked with and I got along with them well. So, but at the same time, you don't want to go into a field where everyone is super different from you and you don't think you would ever mesh with them. So you really have to find that balance about finding the people that you'd work with, but making sure you're not going into the field only because of those people.
Yeah, and I'd also just echo what Maria said. So, when I was thinking about OBGYN, I knew I was kind of hesitant about surgery. And so I did a surgical AI to be sure. And I thought, after my first 2 hysterectomies, I thought it was super cool. But then, by the 4th week, I thought, yeah, this is cool, but I don't see myself doing this long term. So I think thinking realistically, is this just cool right now? And, will this be cool 30 years down the line is helpful. I mean, you don't have to love every single thing, but the thing that you're going to be spending the majority of time doing, you have to take it past the initial like, wow, this is amazing, towards, you know, can I do this forever?
That's really wise. Great. I can speak to like a couple of like very specific procedural things that all three of y'all kind of alluded to, which is that yes, there is a finite time for electives, but just to underscore, fourth year scheduling is very flexible. People are doing add drop all the time, like Ger just was saying. If you come to us in July and are like, oh my God, it's all clear to me now. I need to do this one rotation that has like one empty slot per block and it's taken and we will work it out. We'll work with the specialties to get you what you need to be able to apply. So try not to let that fear overshadow what you do. Another point I wanted to make was if you're thinking about some of the smaller fields that in particular don't have a corresponding third year rotation, do try and do those first. The point I'm trying to make is, say you end up in August deciding that you want to do pediatrics and you haven't had a pediatrics AI scheduled. If we have to, you can still put together an application based on your third year peds grades and the contacts and letter writers that you've made there, but it's pretty nearly impossible to match into a specialty you've never done any rotation in. So if it's coming down to that, try to prioritize the one that you haven't done yet in third year. And then my last point was going to be, this isn't talked about a lot, and in fact, it's not that common. And I think people maybe feel embarrassed about it, but there's a handful of students every year that apply into more than one specialty because they're still not even sure in September which they want to choose. And that is totally fine. And some people need the clarity of like going on interviews and writing about it in their personal statement and meeting people around the country to be able to decide. And that happens, and that's fine. And we can work with you on that too. And then there's a whole group of people that maybe apply to more than one specialty because they want to have a parallel plan, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk. So there's always hope. I feel like when people meet with me because they're undecided, I just have them tell me a little bit about what each of the specialties they're considering and what they like and don't like about it. And then I try and just kind of hold a mirror up to what they're saying and just point out like, wow, you really like brightened up when you talked about this. And like, there seemed to be something holding you back from like jumping into committing to that. So, I mean, that's something you can ask even of your non-medical friends and family too.
Yeah, I actually did something a lot like that with my brother, who is, I mean, he's a resident here, so he knows like what this process is. But I was just talking about it with him at first casually, and then it was just like somehow decided to be my decision making like talk with him or whatever. And he kind of straight up told me, he was just like, you know, you really just sound like a psychiatrist when you talk about this stuff. Like you didn't seem as interested in the other stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I thought about what he said, and like that was enough to like getting another perspective that like sort of like looks at how you are talking about these fields really helps.
Thank you for doing this and walking us through your decision-making process. It really helps. So I wanted to ask, if you're planning on doing 2 AIs to decide between both the fields, would you recommend taking CK? I guess when would you recommend taking CK, before and in between the two or after?
Personally, I took it first because I'm someone who wanted to like, you know, really immerse myself in the AI to make sure I made the right decision. So I wanted to get CK studying out of the way, but I don't think there's a wrong way to do it. And I think, you know, with scheduling being as crazy as it is, I mean, if you can only get it in between 2 or only after, I think that that's okay. They were really flexible with step 2 CK this application cycle. They didn't even need the CK score in until, you know, before rank lists are due. So I'm sure they'll be pretty flexible with you guys. So, I mean, I was just happy doing it earlier, like I said, to get it off my plate. And, you know, we had so much time during quarantine to study that was what I was most comfortable with, but there's no right way.
I similarly, when I planned it originally, I was going to take my CK in the beginning of April, like as my very first block of fourth year, just to get it out of the way, just because I don't like I just wanted to be done with it and have like all of that studying of like fourth year done. Unfortunately, that got like kind of ruined. My plans got ruined. So I took it between my two AIs. I didn't really have that much of a choice, just based on how my scheduling was. And it was fine. I had no problems whatsoever. Not the ideal way I would do it, but didn't affect anything. And to be honest, the break was nice. Like after I took my step exam, I had like a week break before my AI, which was nice. So I don't think you can go wrong doing that. You could also do it after. I don't really see an issue because your scores usually come back in like 3 weeks anyway. So I think whenever you take it would be fine.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that if you're trying to go into a field that you haven't done a rotation before, to prioritize that, especially if you need rec letters, because you don't want to wait till the absolute last minute for those. But honestly, the way our fourth year schedule is set up is you probably have a solid amount of time before you need to put those applications in, that you are probably going to end up doing you can do multiple AIs and your step 2 before all of that's due. But that's the only thing I'd really consider. Otherwise, I don't think it really matters.
Makes sense. Thank you.
We have a chat question around examples of other things you considered when weighing different specialties other than the AI experiences, from Kristen. Did any of you use any of like the like NRMP data or the careers in medicine or Reddit?
I think I used Reddit. I don't know if I recommend Reddit, but I think I did use it. I think I did think about, like, I asked, I don't know if this is things somewhat people care about, but it was something I cared about. Like, what was the future of the field? That mattered a lot to me. I would actually ask like people, like, where do you see the field going? And I got really interesting responses from that. So that mattered a lot to me. I also like had specific interests that I knew I wanted to do. Like I liked working with I liked palliative care, that I figured out at a certain point. So then that kind of weighed heavily into my decision to choose neurology over psychiatry. And for me, I think quality of life was something that mattered to me, but fortunately for me, both of those fields have pretty decent quality of life. Like they had a lot of outpatient opportunities, so I didn't have too much of a difficulty choosing between the two in that regard.
I ended up using that careers in medicine aptitude test kind of thing, but I remember, I think that I was so indecisive that it would change every time. Sometimes it would say, OB, and then I would take it a month later and it'd say IM. So I don't know how much I recommend that, but I think I just kind of took a step back and realized that I'm kind of a pretty indecisive person. And I feel like internal medicine really helped with that because there's so much you can do and so many populations you can work with, so much stuff you can do. And I think for me, that mattered. And so between OB and IM, I think I just realized IM fit kind of my longer term picture of, being able to tailor my career later into like a lot of different things. So I took that into consideration. And then kind of like what everyone else said before, I talked to a lot of my friends and saw kind of what they thought of me and how, like, which specialty kind of fit me better. So those are just some things.
Yeah, I avoid Reddit and student doctor at all costs because it's like 90% fear mongering and nonsense. But for me, I think one of the big things, other than like the actual experience, is like what it is that like I valued in what a physician is, because like that means something different to most everyone. Like for some people, it's like being super analytical and data driven. For some people, that means being very procedural. For some people, that means it's like the psychosocial aspects of care. And most people are trying to balance all of those, but like ultimately you're going to focus on something. So of those kind of things, like what does it act like? What is an ideal physician to you, and like what do you want to be? It's sort of like generic and trite to say something like that, but it really matters because like ultimately in 20 years, like you're going to be a certain type of person at this profession. So make sure you're kind of doing it for the right reasons.
I also thought about like subspecialties. Like I always saw myself as someone that would subspecialize. And so I found that like when I was making my decision, I found that because neurology offered that wide, it's a field where people tend to subspecialize almost always. So like that kind of, that when I was talking to someone like in psychiatry versus neurology, it seemed like that was more important in neurology. And so that kind of pointed me in that direction. So thinking about, do you want to subspecialize later on? Is that something really important to you? Do you care about that at all? Because some fields, it's not really a big deal whether you subspecialize or not. In other fields, it is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and like if you want to be done in 4 years and you just want to like work, like think about that too. If you don't want to do a fellowship and spend multiple years doing that, or so it's something to just take into account.
Did any of you all have kind of like a sudden lightning bolt aha moment, or did you just kind of slowly come to realize that in the last, couple weeks you were leaning towards one or the other, or did you kind of try on the identity of I'm going to apply in this for a while and see how that felt and give yourself a trial period, or how did that work?
I think so I did my child psych AI first, like the first thing when I came back in July. And I essentially went under the assumption, even though I was still like neurology was heavy, like on my mind, I said, okay, I'm going to go into this rotation with like the full understanding that I'm going to be a psychiatrist and like see how do I feel after that. And that kind of helped me better understand that maybe this isn't the right field for me. And I would reflect pretty like often while I was in the rotation. I think like a constant reflection is a good idea when you're on your AI, just to make sure you're happy with what you're doing. And are you getting along with, in general, with the people, with the patients? Like, do you find the patients tiring even in this 1 month? That's a big deal. Like on psych, I was seeing a lot of the same patients for longer periods of time. So I got that opportunity to see, do I get tired out by things like that? So I think towards the end, I kind of got that like light bulb in the opposite direction. Like, oh, I think the other field is going to be the right one for me.
I kept waiting for an aha moment that never happened. Mine was definitely more gradual. So I did my AI that I kind of was more unsure about first, which kind of helped. So I did my OB one first. And then after that, I loved it, but I kind of realized that maybe internal medicine was more for me. And then I did an internal medicine elective. It kind of kept growing a little bit. And then I did my internal medicine AI. And then at the end of that, I just kind of knew it was right for me, but I still never had that light bulb feeling. And I think that was really, it made me unsure of things. But, I think some people do have that aha moment, but a lot of people don't. So don't let that scare you, because I don't think people talk about how it's mostly a gradual process for a lot of people. So yeah, mine was definitely a gradual.
Yeah, I sort of had an aha moment, but it wasn't like I was like doing something clinically and then I was like, oh, this is it. It was like I was thinking about it. I was like actively thinking about it. And my like realization was that I was coming up with reasons for why I liked other fields, but I sort of had the reasons in my mind already for why I liked psych. So the idea that it was more of a passive thought that I already knew was my aha moment, that I wasn't trying to like justify it in my head. So that was kind of what it was for me. But again, it wasn't like a singular moment or experience that changed that. It was like weeks of thinking about it that led to that.
And I really believe for a lot of people, there's probably more than one specialty they'd be happy in too. And that's probably why a lot of people don't have this moment of clarity. Any other questions?
One thing that I know was kind of stressful for me was letters of recommendation with like the possibility of 2 specialties. And I ended up actually, so I feel like if you do two AIs or senior electives, you get pretty close to both. So I ended up actually using a letter from the other specialty, and I think that's completely fine because that is someone who knows you very well. But I will say just kind of let people know that you're between two specialties so they don't write the letter too early for the wrong specialty. So for me, Dr. Rigby for OB offered to write a letter. I just told her, can you wait a little bit? And I didn't even tell her till a month before applications were due. And then she wrote an internal medicine letter. But from interviews, people say that they can really see that, like, I guess the decision-making process that went into it, because I was nervous it would look weird that I had AIs in two things and that people would question my, I guess, commitment to one field. But in that letter, they kind of talked about my decision. And I think that that really helped kind of solidify the application towards one field, even if it is a letter from, a completely different field.
Yeah, I had the exact same situation. When I was on child psych, I was with the same attending for 1 month, and I told them, like, from the get-go that I'm undecided between psych and neuro. And at the end, I said, would you write me a letter of recommendation for regardless which field I end up choosing? And she was like, yeah, absolutely. And I think she wrote in my application, like in my letter, about how I was undecided, because it did, one or two people did ask, but it didn't come off as like oh, why are you not committed to this field? It definitely just was like, oh, well, what was your thought process? Because it's just another way for them to find out, oh, what do you love about our field? So it's okay. I was also concerned about the fact that, oh, I'm doing two AIs like right before applications. It's gonna seem like I don't want to do this field. They're not gonna want me because they're gonna think I'm not committed. But I think it's incredibly normal. I think a lot of people choose pretty late, so I don't think it's an issue.
Any other parting words of advice or other questions?
So I guess what I was going to say is sort of commenting on what this last this chat. So the question was, were any of those fears realized during the interview trail thus far? So I basically talk about my decision-making process basically at every interview. And honestly, most of the time I bring it up, it's because it's sort of like they ask you, why are you going into this field? And it's hard to explain that without explaining that you were very undecided. It's just a natural way to bring for that to come up. Sometimes, they'll see my like research experience and be like, well, why did you do a radiology and an ophthalmology paper so close to all of this? And I think, just being honest about your thought process and like what you learned during your M3 year and how that factored into your decision is the most important thing. I've never had a scenario where I talked about that and it seemed like they didn't believe me or that I wasn't committed to the field. I think people legitimately want to know what you were kind of thinking about. And honestly, in basically every field, like they want people who have interests in medicine as a whole. They don't want a psychiatrist that only knows how to do psychiatrist things, because I mean, you're a doctor as a whole. So it's never really a concern as long as like you actually want to go into the field. That's the only thing. Like if it comes across as disingenuous, of course that's a concern, but deciding between multiple fields really isn't.
Yeah, I would say it has come up a couple times where people will say, oh, we saw that on your application you did an AI in this field and you have research in OB, but that's not what you're going into. But then they read the letter that, I had from my OB doctor, from Dr. Rigby, and they kind of see the decision process. And if kind of like what Ger just said, it does prove that you kind of thought through your specialty choices, and it makes you even more committed because you've really thought it through. At least from my experiences, that's what it seems like. And then for the obstacles about not having interest. So yeah, I had a lot of OB stuff on my application and not a lot of internal medicine stuff, but it didn't really seem, like a problem to a lot of people. I also had a lot of things that were just not specialty specific on there. Like a lot of organizations, I didn't have like a lot, but I had a few things that I was really committed to and I could talk about them pretty in depth that weren't specialty related. And I think that those are the things they like to talk about more, just things that you are really invested in. So if you don't have things screaming interest in, radiology or something, I think it's okay as long as you can adequately talk about why that field is for you and that you've thought through it. And then for other things on your CV, as long as you have things that you're invested in and you can speak to, I think it would be okay.
Yeah, for me, yeah, it's similar to Gurj's. Like I got it was asked every single time, you know, why do you choose X field? And for me, the answer to your question is just, it's all about framing. Like, how do you frame your story? So if you frame it in the right way, no one's going to question why you were doing the, like, why I did psych research since I was 18. So I did psych research for 10 years and then I chose neurology. No one asked me why did I do that, but I talked about my research as part of my journey. Like I talked about it as my journey into being interested in the brain instead of saying, oh, that was because I was interested in psych. I said I was interested in the brain. And then when I got into medical school, I actually did a research that was it was like psych, but it was in neurology patients. So I said, you know, I started making this shift, and then, you know, I did my AI and my clerkship, and then you just go into detail about how much you love the patients and what you liked about that, and it just kind of shows that progression of your choice. And as long as you do that, I think it's okay. I don't think you'll come into any difficulties. And as far as like specific interest groups or professional organizations, I purposefully didn't join any specialty, or I didn't become like a leader of any specialty specific interest groups, just in case I changed my mind. The one thing I wanted to do in medicine was like advocacy and like more like social justice related things. So I focused my specialty like leadership groups on that. And it came up in every single like interview. Everyone wanted to talk about it. And no one seemed to care that my research was in psych. They all asked about it and they were all really interested in it. So I don't think it's a big deal, and they're aware. Like a lot of applicants, that happens too. They like research in general because they like to see that like you know how to do research, you understand the process of what happens in research, because then you can apply that to the field of your choice in the future.
I just want to underscore what they have all just said from like the faculty and dean's perspective, which is we all know that like specialty stability is very malleable. You know, very few students come in wanting to do one thing and that persists throughout. And so I just wanted you all to hear that like people know that, and also echo the points that were made around it's all about the narrative and how you're spinning this. So like to Gurjis's earlier statement about what are kind of your core values and what kind of doctor do you want to be, that probably is actually a commonality through all of these things, even though they have a different specialty title on all of them. And you can use your personal statement and interview to create that narrative and really highlight it for folks. All right, last call. No. All right. Good. Well, thank you again to our panelists. That was really sweet how you all spoke so candidly and insightfully and thoughtfully. It was really nice to hear your stories, and I am sure that all of the participants benefited from that. So for those of you that have friends that might not have been able to join tonight, I've got this recorded and I will send it along to be posted on eCurriculum so others can benefit as well. And I'm always happy to meet individually with anybody that has any further questions. Just let me know. So thanks again. Really appreciate it. And you all have a wonderful night.
Bye, everyone.
I think everybody's just coming back. John and Wendy, is there, did you all want to bring anything back?
No, I think for at least from our discussions, people are really working through this really well. And I hope that kind of as we go through the day, we're going to have more opportunities to kind of refine this. But we wanted to get kind of the language out there and in some ways in a comical way, iterate. These are things that are usually iterated. You don't have, no one comes out, you know, from birth with the perfect research question that, you know, comes down with the stone tablets and you have the answer. And so I enjoyed that in our small groups, and I'm hoping that the other small groups also had that opportunity.
Cool. All right. So Teresa and I are going to move on to conceptual frameworks. Teresa, do you want to kind of take over there?
Yeah, I am going to replace Spotlight for a second. Blue Spotlight. Okay, hello everyone. Okay, so I got to nerd out about like my favorite part of meta research, which is something that blew my mind when I first learned it. And some of you, I'm going to invite Sally back up because he's my co-host for this section. It's my favorite part because I think that conceptual frameworks and theories and theoretical frameworks, they help you orient yourself. And so what ends up happening is that I think that in most research, you're just trying to find an answer. Yeah, does this drug, yes or no? How far is it from here to the moon? It comes from a big paradigm called like a positivist frame, that positivist, or in some points would say post-positivist framework, which is that there is a real truth out there. You know, you're like Fox Mulder, the truth is out there. For some of you who are too young for that, it's from the X-Files. And so the idea would be that you're seeking the truth, you know this out there somewhere, and you're trying to get too close, right? Like, so Lara Varpio is one of my friends and colleagues and heroes, really. And she kind of talks about, like, if you have a table, a positivist says, okay, we can measure this table. We can get down to the nanomicrons or whatever they're called, the smallest unit of measurement. We'll get as precise as humanly possible. A post-positivist would be someone who says, yeah, like our rulers are imprecise. So, you know, I'm going to just use the measuring tape I have and get close enough to that number. And then and be okay with there being a margin of error, right? Because if Meg comes along or Sally comes along and measures the same table, they're going to get a different result, and we're going to just call it there to be a confidence interval around that table's measurement, right? And then I think that what conceptual frameworks also bring in is that sometimes measuring a table is not all there's at with a table, right? Because if I put a table in the operating room, that table is a very different table than if I put it in your dining room, right? And it's a very different table if I put it on the dais of a conference hall. Each of those tables might have a different role, right? So especially in the conference hall, if it's got all the medical student diplomas for all your med students, that table is a really important table all of a sudden for a very ceremonial reason, right? And so the constructivist kind of like theories and perspectives on research kind of come into that. And I've been avoiding using the term epistemology because it's hard to say, and it took me a long time to learn how to say it. But really what it is that there are different ways of knowing about the world. And so each of these is a different way of orienting yourself and having a theoretical perspective on how we know about the truth. And that's like the first concept I wanted to introduce is, what are your epistemic or epistemological perspectives on what the truth is? So I'm going to ask everyone to get in there in the chat and just put, do you think of yourself more as a positivist? Like, do you see the world as something measurable? A post-positivist? Like, yeah, good enough. I think most emergent docs are probably in that category. Or the last one, which is a constructivist model, where I'm going to be more interested in how we construct meaning and get to a truth that's a shared mental model, and that might vary between cultures. Post-positivist, yep, we've got some post and constructivist. Okay, yep. It didn't say you had to, you could pick and definitely. It's not just an or, right? Sally, how would you describe yourself?
I'm a post and constructivist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, teachers are please all the teachers out there, co-teachers and mentors here on this conference. You're not immune from me asking you on your on your chat to participate. So if you can, that's great. Meg, I know, right? Big words. I can't type them. I really can't. I'm like, I would have written con and just exclamation mark. I'm glad there's spell check, but there's no spell check in Zoom chat yet. So,
I put post-positivist. I remember the first time I encountered this was I had a paper that was in Rhyme, and somebody wrote a paper about the papers in Rhyme about their apparent research philosophy, and I was like, huh.
I have a research philosophy.
I have a research philosophy, and I was like, yeah, that's probably right. And certainly in this paper, I think it can change depending on what kind of questions you're asking, and
exactly
that will come up a little bit in the methods talk too. This is really a nice lay in when I get to talk next.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. So I'm laying it up because I want you to slam it down later, but I'm gonna give you the layout. I guess, I don't know. It's like volleyball, right? I'm gonna be the person that sets the ball for John to slam down later. But the idea would be that your theoretical perspective on how you see it. So I would say that I didn't offer the real, like the frame that I come at it, which is a pragmatist. I will use whichever paradigm suits my question. And that's how I would describe myself. So I am post-positive or constructivist and varyingly, and I actually don't know that I could ever be a positivist because I'm not detail oriented to get to that kind of level of precision that's probably required. I am an emerged true and true. And so the analogy that I have there is really like, how do you construct truth? How do you think through that? So that's one of the analogies. The other analogy that has been in the literature in the past was by one of my grad school professors, George Bordage. He's a family doc from Canada, moved down to US to become a emeritus researcher. And he writes a while ago about looking at conceptual frameworks as if they were lenses. So the idea would be, if you have a rose-colored lens, you'll see the world differently. If you have a yellow lens, you'll filter out all the blue light, those kind of things, right? So the idea would be that they're a way for you to see the world. And they shade the way you see. On the flip side, there's another group by Laura Varpio and Elise Paradis and a couple others who have challenged that paradigm and shifted us to think through our theoretical frameworks as being kind of more of that lens. And then maybe there's something called a conceptual framework that they talk about, that talks about how that theory plays out in a context. And so when you look up conceptual frameworks, there's a little bit of, let's say, there's a little bit of a debate out there as to how you define these terms. But generally speaking, what I usually tell people is theoretical or conceptual frameworks are a mishmash of frameworks and like triangles and like flower pictures and different things that represent how you would organize your thinking around a research project. So what the label is less important as the fact that it's a key step in doing your health professions education or medical education research, because our field really likes having these in the works that are published. So for instance, when you publish in a paper, in a journal, people are like, you haven't clearly defined your theoretical or conceptual framework. Can you be more explicit? You'd be like, I have a conceptual framework. So putting that in, baking it in the beginning is important. So I'm going to kick over to Sally to kind of kick us off into a little bit more of how, from an editor's point of view, how do you look at it when you're reading a paper, for instance?
Yeah. So I think we all struggle with conceptual framework. So if anybody is feeling like, oh my God, I don't know, especially with, which one do I choose? And is it positivist or positivist, or am I pragmatic, that kind of thing. And I just want to step back and talk a little bit about kind of conceptual frameworks. I often think of it as kind of it's the way in which we think the world works, and that as you design your project, you want to be thinking about the way you think it works. And so I'm going to use just kind of physics examples. So it's kind of, I like to think about gravity. And so if we're measuring whether or not a pound of lead or a pound of feathers falls at the same rate, then we're testing the effects of gravity. If we're measuring bias in assessment, we might not tell people whether or not it's lead or feathers. And we would say, which one do you think is going to fall quicker, right? A pound of lead, a pound of feathers. And that might be actually getting to issues of bias. If you're trying to measure like wind field, right, then you're going to do different sizes of things. But it is to say that you want to be thinking about how you think the world works as you design your projects. I'm going to take just a practical, a worked example. And so, many of us are moving to Zoom with a chat or Zoom with a Slack. And we believe that these sideline conversations are helping people learn. If we wanted to measure that or study that, we could look at it through different lenses. And so you might choose like self-determination theory as a lens. So self-determination theory was kind of popularized in Drive by Heath. And it basically says that what motivates people is connectedness, autonomy, and competence. And so if that's the lens with which I want to see the world, I can then say, how does Slack or how does chat help people learn, or how do they use that using that lens? And so then you could actually kind of do a qualitative analysis of the Slack channel or the chat and say, wow, are people having comments because they're trying to connect with people? Are people having comments because they're really trying to understand something and that's getting to their confidence? Are they having comments because they know the answer and they're talking about autonomy? And so thinking about how you approach the question or the project helps you decide which lens you're going to take. Similarly, if you're looking at Slack, you might be saying, how are people learning and what level are they learning? At which point you might use a Miller's as an assessment. Are they talking about what they know? Are they talking about what they do? Are they talking about, which level of Miller's assessment? One also might do it in terms of a program evaluation. We've instituted Slack and we want to know how effective is this? And so you might take a lens of program evaluation using Kirkpatrick or Moore. And so depending on what you're doing, depending on your lens or what your question is, it depends on what kind of questions you're going to ask. Teresa, is that questions or comments on that?
Yeah, that's exactly the way I think about it. One of the things that can be quite overwhelming about learning about these theories, though, is that you're like, how do I even know about all of these? Like, how would I find them? And I would say that was the most daunting thing for me, is that people kind of, it's like you have to go theory shopping or something. And so what it is that you have to acknowledge that in health professions education, we're not atheoretical. We just don't have a single discipline that we're beholden to. We actually are pretty amalgamated we're more of a field, right? So in this field, there are people from nursing, and in program evaluation, there's sociologists, there's anthropologists. Everyone brings their content expertise to our field. And so therefore, as clinicians, our worldview as a clinician, and that's not a really well-defined, that's why I see myself as a pragmatist, because I come at it from, will it work for me as a teacher? Will it work for my learners in the clinical environment? The theory is all well and good, but I come at it from more of an applied sense. And so those are worthwhile to acknowledge, but it means that we have to read basically a lot of other people's literature to find the theories and the conceptual frameworks and theoretical frameworks that work for us. And so to help with that, the Allium team actually has created the Education Theory Made Practical books. It's part of our incubator program. We've published them open source. There's also the IceNet blog that actually has a lot of the same content, just as it's like the preprint version of it. So you can look at IceNet blog. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. And I'll just screen share real quick so you can kind of see quickly what it looks like. So this is the ICE blog. If it's they're going to reorganize things, but if you go to categories and scroll down, there's actually a category. Oh, my mouse is going crazy. There is a way for you to actually look at educational theory as a category. So if you click there, and I'll just put that in the chat as well as a link, you can actually find a bunch of the theory kind of summaries, one pagers more or less, that look like this. And so it'll be like cold learning theory. Okay, well, I'm not sure what that is. So you can read into it. It's case-based. So you'll be able to like kind of think through. It's kind of like John and Wendy's scenario earlier. It's like they literally do exactly what, but in written format. So it's less awesome and hilarious and less method acting, but you can imagine then it contextualizes it. The other thing you can do is go to the other page that I was talking about, allium.com/library. And there's 3 books here right now that are Education Theory 1, 2, and 3. Open access, you can download on PDF or get them on iTunes. So, and these ones, generally speaking, when I open them, the idea would be that they take you to ResearchGate, and then you can actually click into the book to actually look at the file. And so you'll have to download it, but you'll see it's a proper laid out book and things like that. Okay. So that's all. It's just to make it easier for you, so you don't have to go hunting too hard. They're not comprehensive, but they're a kickstart for you, because if you fall in love with cognitive load theory, it has annotated bibliographies for you to actually go deep dive and fall down the Wikipedia rabbit hole and or literature rabbit hole, PubMed rabbit hole, to read about all the different ways. So those are a couple of quick and dirty ways to do that.
Good. These are useful. All right, we're going to have you all go back to your groups. I think there's one of two options. If you all kind of got deeply involved in whatever research question, you could actually use your group to say, well, what is our conceptual framework for our research question? If you did not really kind of solidify on a research question, there was a task in the on the worksheet that you could do instead. So just say that you're in a simulation program. You're trying to prepare residents for the responsibility of running a team. What conceptual framework might you use? So either of those questions is okay. And Doug, we are going back to our breakout rooms, and we for 20 minutes for this session. So we are on break now for 10 minutes to 11:55 or 10:55 that time. All right, welcome back, everybody. Where's Teresa? Cool. All right, so we are moving on to like how to measure, how to do your research question. So John and Jamie, quant and qual, go for it.
All right, everybody able to see a beginning of a slide here. I know that PowerPoint slides and Zoom is foreboding, but I also hate looking at my own face as I talk. And so I like to bring up images and hopefully be a little bit distractible. I and Dr. Jamie Jordan are going to kind of work through some things here with you. I have the first round looking at the combination of how to select methods, quantitative analysis, and assessment approaches. So a lot to kind of dig through here a little bit, but we're going to try, and I will try and be not as verbose, and then I will hand it over to Dr. Jordan. So talking about methods, you know, we were talking about conceptual frameworks just last, you know, how should you pick your studies methods? So something I like to think about is what is best. You know, people like to think about there being a hierarchy of methods, and sometimes that can be helpful in understanding evidence in a causal relationship. But I hate this diagram, and some of the reasons you might think I hate this diagram is what we've already talked about in the conceptual framework. How that can be limiting, and how if we only understand certain ways of knowing, certain ways of measuring, certain ways of evidence being better or worse, that greatly limits our ability to understand problems in a complex and nuanced ways. It really constrains us to a very positivist, post-positivist way of thinking, even though that's tends to be who I am. So I like to bring up the idea of what is the gold standard. So we always talk about the gold standard as either randomized control trials or in some cases autopsy, but what is the best? And I want to challenge you to think about, you know, what makes something the best? Is it the best because it's at the top of that pyramid? Or is it the best because it's the best way to answer the question in the way that we want to understand those answers? Or the best way that we want to build on the knowledge or make a decision about what should be our next hypothesis? It isn't that one is better than the other. So I want you to think of today as June 5th, 1933, which obviously we all know is the day that FDR took us off the gold standard. So I'm going to take us off the gold standard today and say there are a lot of ways to approach this space. And I want people to kind of try and engage with me, try and keep it an open mind. And we'll try and run through a lot of different ways of this that we can go. And I set this talk up in a couple different ways of framing the idea of how do I think about methods, because I'm a methods dork. One of the reasons I am giving this talk is I try and outdork Trisha Chan. I'm an MD, PhD in education because that was where the money was at. Our respect for teachers. I just wanted a little bit of that for myself. So when I think about methods, I think about them in kind of broad strokes. I think about asking questions about why something is or how is something related. And that actually drives a lot of my decisions about conceptual framework and methods. And I think most of the time we think about why as qualitative methods. And my colleague is going to talk extensively about that, in part because I think they're very hard. My wife wrote her dissertation using qualitative methods, and I thought that looked hard. And so I like to do numbers where I don't have to listen to people or perhaps even talk to them. And that is where my comfort level really lies. And so we're going to focus on introduction to quantitative methods. So using my love of scaffolding and frameworks and how do I bring all these pieces of information together, I'm going to steal from the University of Oxford, which, stealing from an institution that's been around for hundreds of years, I think is fair game, about how do I organize these methods in my head. So I have this why versus how, which kind of tends to lean towards quant versus qual, or qual versus quant to have the analogy be mirrored. And then I start asking me some simple questions. What is the aim of my study? Why am I doing it? What am I trying to obtain? So beyond my why and how, am I trying to describe what a population looks like? That tends to be a descriptive study, and that can be qual, that can be surveys, that can be kind of polls. That has importance if that's what your end goal is. However, your end goal is to quantify how things relate to each other. That entails using different methods, and that entails usually different quantitative methods. So after I've decided, hey, I want to know how this thing and that thing are related, then I try and think about, well, how am I going to set this up? So I think, am I choosing who gets to have this intervention, or am I not? So if we talked about in our analogy where I was coming back from Fiji, we were talking about an experimental design where we were randomizing people to either receive an intervention or not. And that puts you into the randomized experimental trial versus an observational trial, which is actually where I do a lot of work using secondary data analysis, where I don't actually get to decide what the exposure is. I don't get to decide what the intervention is. I use what happened and try and understand it in a different way. So yes or no, are we making that decision? So question 3 leads me to think about, well, is this a cohort, cross-sectional, case control? You've probably seen those things in the method section and thought, ugh, I don't know what that word soup is. And they all start with C for some reason, which is unusual and unhelpful. But another way to think about it is, in a cohort study, I'm deciding about what my outcome is after the exposure intervention happens. So after everybody, all the people that were exposed to lead in Flint, what are their outcomes? That's a cohort study. Versus a cross-sectional analysis where I'm making the same decision about intervention as the outcome. And that can be retrospective or that can be like some of my work looking at career decision-making. Where do people end up going? And what are the exposures or interventions that I'm going to measure that seem to make an impact on that outcome? And then the case control is before the exposure is determined. So you're going to decide, I'm going to compare people that had this thing that's going to happen, that may happen to them versus those that don't, and see kind of what happens to them. So that can also be important in educational design because you can decide who's going to receive an exposure or not, or you can decide who's going to be at a school with arts and sciences. You can not decide, but you can observe and you can follow those cases out. But taking it to an even more simple way, I think the way I think about quantitative designs is I think about what do I care about and how am I going to measure what I care about? And then how am I going to measure how that relates to the outcome? So in this Rube Goldberg thing, we can go back to that big scaffolding, but what do I care about? How am I going to measure what I care about? And how do I measure how do I decide what I think I care about? That's a conceptual framework question. How am I going to measure that? And then I'm going to test that relationship. How are those top two arrows related to this bottom arrow, or the top one arrow related to? How is that basketball related to that person being punched in the face? So there's a number of analytical quantitative methods, and I'm not going to belabor them extensively, but just to kind of give a general review for those of you who have seen some of these things and thought about them, or don't know much about them, or are statisticians lying in wait to make me feel bad about myself in a few moments. We think about very basic things that you might see in the literature about t-tests, where you're looking at differences in means, or in a simple single sample, you're looking at how things are different or the same. And you can think about bivariate linear regression, which is, as x changes, or as x changes, what does y do? How is one thing related to another thing? And then ANOVA starts to bring in multiple categories. And then you get into more advanced methodology looking at multivariate regression. So linear regression is looking at things with a continuous outcome. Logit and probit, logistic regression and probit, are slightly different ways of looking at things with a categorical outcome. So logit can be multiple outcomes or two, binary, and probit is about probability. So that's usually one or no. And that looks at how we understand that outcome related to all those other things in that Rube Goldberg diagram that we had before. Kind of going up another level of advancement, you can then start to think about, well, what other factors and how are they related are we considering? So sometimes you think in a regression model, oh, I have all these factors all listed out, but some of them don't act independently, which is an assumption of that test. So how do they interact together? So is race and gender, they have impacts themselves, but do they have impact combined? So does being a Black woman have an independent effect of being Black and being a woman? That's an interaction term. Then we can think about fixed effects, things that are unchanged or that the data is missing. Another way to think about that's hierarchical modeling. So, we all exist actually in situations. So we actually need to control when we're doing this kind of test. What is the effect of being in a specific school? So if my training, I was in med school at Case Western, is that different than my training if I'd been at University of Michigan or at Washington University or at GW? That actually has an effect independent of my factors, but related to everybody that trained with me at that institution. So how do we think about those things in these kind of more and more advanced quantitative methods? And I'm not adding all these layers on to be like, you have to be doing hierarchical modeling to be doing good work. I'm bringing them up to show you that you can go from very simple ideas of statistics to very complex ideas. And it's just about adding more ability to understand the world in its complex nature. So finally, just a few more examples of other things that I think are cool that you may come across. Causal inference. So, we're going back to our talk about the gold standard and RCT and how it can tell us how things are related. You actually can look at things that are related in a way that would be not unethical in education, using the natural experiments that occur. So causal inference is regression just continuity is the one I like best to think about, is greatly studied in things like students who got scholarships. So if you got a scholarship, if your exam score was above 50, the difference between getting a 50.1 and a 49.9 on the test is probably actually not that different in the person, but you can actually measure how that affected that scholarship because that was where the cut point was, what that causal inference was. You can look at event history modeling or hazard modeling in the clinical environment, looking at how long things take to have happen. How long after you intervene in this education does it take for a person to have a behavioral change? Or how long does it take for their skills to degrade? You can look at which factors are the most dominant in explaining your outcome, not just on their magnitude, but which one, if you remove from that model, would be the most important. You can look at how long it takes or how many pieces of data you need to have a reliable score. So we use generalizable theory in looking at Do our clinical scores actually reflect a reliable and valid assessment? These are all other methods that you can use kind of in quantitative world to look at these questions. So, you know, I'd love to go more deep into this, but we only have 20 minutes to do a yeoman's amount of work. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that, and we can talk more in the small groups. And I did include here at the bottom, you can still do randomized control trials. I have a randomized control trial that has a crossover effect. So if we sometimes think, well, I can't do a randomized control trial. We can't just teach some people some things and some things not if we know that this helps. But you can't, if you don't know, you can teach and then teach something else and flip it over. So those are all things that we can talk about in our groups, but hopefully this is giving you kind of a big overview of the plethora of quantitative methods that you might entail and how they may be interrelated and how you can kind of wrap your head around it. So pivoting to assessment, assessment and quantitative methods are often interlinked because of our comfort with quantitative methods and quantitative measures in medicine. It's not that one is superior, that quantitative assessment is better than qualitative assessment. It's that it's easier and we like it, and numbers are comforting. And I'll tell you that as somebody who finds numbers comforting sometimes, instead of all the mishmashy themes that sometimes we have to explore in qual. So just to have a common language, lots of people talk about this distinction different, and I'm sure Dr. Chan is going to have a really much better understanding of this than I do perhaps, but I like to think about assessment and evaluation in this way so that we have a common language in what I'm talking about. Assessment can be formative, where it's giving you ways to improve, or summative, where it brings together kind of all the things that they've exposed, but is generally added towards a learner in teaching. And how does that person get better? How do we understand their learning? How do we understand their change? Evaluation is usually about a judgment. It's a judgment of programs. It's a judgment of effectiveness or efficacy. And that can still be used to make changes, but it's in a different place with a different goal in mind. I like to bring this up. What is your own experience with assessment? I actually experienced a very similar thing as this cartoon would indicate. My dissertation chair, who I love and continue to publish with, once wrote on a paper of mine during grad school, "You are not a good writer." That was the comment. And I'm not sure that was the best assessment, but man, did it make me want to figure out what the heck he was talking about. So, you know, what is good assessment? What is bad assessment? Oftentimes we talk about something called authentic assessment. And I often like to joke in opposed to what? Inauthentic assessment, where you actually aren't paying attention, or you're like, I'll just write down whatever I like. And as somebody who's read those reviews where they just check the boxes down the Likert scale, which is how you pronounce it, which is another thing. Anyway, you can have an authentic assessment, but when we know about good assessment, we think about it being a continuous, not just a single moment, that we have a long-term relationship, that it's in context with what our learning, what our practice, what we're trying to get better at, that it's process driven, that it's individualized, and that it's higher order focus, which can all be buzzy words, but it's really about how do you affect behavioral change? And it's not about you being a good person, but being good at this skill. It's not just read more, which is the classic med student evaluation or assessment that we give. And how do we build assessments that get at that? We brought up Miller's and Kirkpatrick a little bit. This is one of the classic assessment theories that you'll come across. And like everything in medical education that's adapted, almost everything, it's a pyramid. You'll see like 15 pyramids probably by the end of today. And it has higher levels of measurement from novice to expert, not because, again, knows is better than shows versus better than does, but because it requires a higher level of understanding of the material. And so it's not that you shouldn't ever measure knows. As you can see, there are different methods of assessment that we use depending on what our goal is, because you have to know something before you can do it. And so if you want to know if somebody can do something safely before they do it to a patient, that's not unreasonable. It just is insufficient often. Another way we think about assessment is in this longitudinal process from novice to master, as we go from rules to authentic, automatic thinking and intuitive, but that actually can actually bring in bias and other things. This is not a perfect model, and it's not the linear model that is often brought forward. Kolb's is another classic that you'll hear a lot about, a cycle, about this idea that it isn't just a longitudinal direction. You don't go from novice to master and there's no turning around, that it's just going forward and there's not a reflective piece. And then, given my love of pyramids, this is something Sally and I think pulled together a long time ago, or Henry Pohl did and we stole, looking at how does this all come together? Because as I said earlier, I'm a lumper, not a divider. And it always drove me a little nuts to be like, well, why do we have to have the same, why do we have to call this level, nose versus novice versus remembering versus all of these things, when actually they're quite interrelated. Deep breath, almost done. So how do we make assessments? What are some experiences we've had with assessments? Well, there's classroom approaches. We've all went to school. We've done exams and quizzes and homework, standardized tests. Those tend to be quantitative measures. Papers are more qualitative, perhaps. We can think about assessments as either normative versus criterion based. Are you just trying to get over the bar that this is safe? We can think about how step one has been designed and how it has been used in the past and how it's changed. Step one was designed as a criterion base. Are you safe to practice at this level? But it became a normative criterion, and it wasn't designed for that. It became, are you better by 5 points than this person, which wasn't what the test was designed for. It didn't do actually that very well, which is why they moved back to only reporting the criterion basis. What was the goal of that assessment? Something that may come up in the second part, learner portfolios. How do we understand things in a qualitative sense? How do we move beyond assessment that is just easy numbers on that nose or lower Miller signs? It can be performance-based. How do we assess something either in a simulation lab or in work-based assessment? How do we do assessment that is in situ or practical? And then finally, is it based off of time? Is it, how much do we assess based on how long you've spent learning this? Have you spent your 4 years in residency? Or have you developed the competencies that we think are important? Assessment can be tied to a time way of thinking things about grades and test scores and courses, or specific competencies. And how do we use that assessment to make both our formative and our summative assessments of our learners? But I am going to wrap up here, and I'm just going to bring it back to the thing that I think is the most key thing about understanding methods. When you're thinking about your methods, think about what you care about and how you're going to measure it. And think about how you're going to measure what you think relates to it. At least when you're in the math, the world that I love in, that's the simplest way to think about it. So that was a lot of material, and I'm going to take a sip of my Diet Coke and transition to Dr. Jordan, who is going to probably do this in a much more active learning style, because again, I'm more of a theoretical educator in that I understand that it exists, but I don't actually perform the teaching of it to others. So thank you for your attention.
All right, thanks, John. I am also going to be using some slides here, so give me just a second. Let's see if I can share my screen. All right, so this is going to be a very brief overview of qualitative methods. I think, like as John highlighted, there's just not enough time to get into a lot of detail, but hopefully we'll go over some broad strokes. All right, so the purpose of qualitative research is really to focus on in-depth understanding of human experience. And John used the comparison of how versus why for qualitative versus quantitative. I actually like to think about qualitative as answering how and why. So some examples might be, how do education researchers succeed in publishing their work? Or why do residents choose an academic career path? So here I think is a helpful table, just kind of doing like a side-by-side comparison of the key differences between quantitative methods that we just learned about and then qualitative methods. And so again, I think we sort of differ in just the types of questions that I think, but I tend to think about qualitative questions as the how or the why questions. And I think about quantitative methods as more answering the the what and where and when types of questions. You can see that in terms of hypothesis testing or hypothesis generating, qualitative is going to be much more hypothesis generating. And John kind of mentioned this too, when you're thinking about the data differences, quantitative really does deal with numbers and precise measurements, whereas qualitative deals with words, observations, even objects. Your sampling strategy is also going to be different. So with qualitative work, your sample is probably going to be smaller and really purposeful and deliberate, as opposed to those larger random samples that we're generally trying to achieve in quantitative work. And your design will often be inductive and actually may change throughout your study in a qualitative research design. But in the end, you're really going to have this rich contextual data. But on the downside, it's very time consuming and your results are going to be more difficult to generalize because that's really not the purpose of qualitative work. So just some basic strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research. Like I mentioned, qualitative work really does provide you with rich information about real situations and context. And this increased detail can provide more opportunities to glean meaningful insights into really complex phenomena. It also allows for an in-depth and comprehensive understanding of human experiences and social and behavioral processes. And I think qualitative research is much more flexible than quantitative. And so data is often reviewed on an ongoing basis. And if there appears to be a lack of results or some sort of new information or phenomenon emerges, the research design can immediately shift to gather new data in a different direction. And this really leads to more opportunities to learn more about a subject or phenomena rather than just being limited by some predetermined protocol. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, the sample sizes are usually smaller, so that may make it easier to access participants. And data collection in qualitative work is typically an open-ended process. This allows for the encouragement of subjects to really express themselves with authenticity. And then finally, as I mentioned, qualitative research is great for hypothesis generation, which is particularly helpful when little is known about a topic. Now, like anything else, there's also some weaknesses, and we should certainly acknowledge these. So the scope may be narrow with qualitative work due to the in-depth nature of the approaches, and the findings may not be easily generalizable to other settings. Again, that's generally not the purpose. It can be very time consuming to collect and analyze data. And like we said before, it's really difficult to test hypotheses. And the data collection and analysis can be subjective and is often influenced by the researcher. So it is really important to have a skilled researcher conducting this work. Replicating the results may be difficult, and it also, I think, is sometimes challenging to present the results in a meaningful way. So let's just talk briefly about the different types of designs. And this is definitely not an all-inclusive list, but there's just a few examples of things that you might commonly see. And like any research study, I think the design you choose is really going to be based on your research question. So let's just talk about each one of these. So case study. So this is great for getting an in-depth understanding about a particular case or issue. So an example question that might align well with this type of design would be, how do 4 medical students experience imposter syndrome during training? Now, ethnography is a description of customs of peoples and cultures. So if we are interested in doing an ethnographic study, then a question we might ask would be, how is healthcare and the role of the physician viewed by a certain group of people within our society? Now, narrative research is great for chronological or story-oriented questions. So an example question might be, how does being a physician impact a person throughout their life? Grounded theory, so this design really focuses on developing a theory by exploring the data. It lends itself really well to process type questions. So maybe, for example, what processes promote resilience in medical trainees? Phenomenology, so this explores what people experience related to a certain phenomena. So again, an example question might be, why do medical students often match in residencies that are near their medical schools? And then finally, participatory action research. So this is really work to understand a problematic situation and identify solutions. So something, a research question that might be aligned well with this type of design would be, how do we recruit and retain underrepresented in medicine faculty in our department? So you can see there's a lot of different ways and approaches that you can use. And again, it's all going to stem from the question that you're trying to address. Just as there are many types of designs, there's also many different ways of collecting data and qualitative research. And many of these can be used with any of the different approaches that I just mentioned. And you can actually use combinations of data sources, but your data could come from interviews, focus groups, observations, free response questions on survey, etc. Now, just a quick word about sampling. So like we mentioned before, in qualitative research, you really do want to be purposeful in your sampling for the most part and select participants who will be best able to address your research question. And like anything else, there are a myriad of purposive sampling strategies out there, but we don't have time to go into them. But I'm happy to chat later about different ways to approach this. The other thing is that rather than being determined by a power calculation, your sample size is really going to be determined by something called saturation. And if that's a term that's new to you, this is just really the point at which you find that you're not learning any additional information with further data collection and analysis. And then so at that point, you can stop collecting data. All right, so we talked a little bit about design, sampling, and data collection, and we're going to just briefly move into analysis. So there are a lot of different ways to code and analyze qualitative data, and these are really just a few. And again, this decision will be based on your research question, the type of data that you have, and the approach that you're using. And there really isn't a right or wrong answer here. It's just important that you describe your rationale and your justification for the choices that you make in your analysis. All right, and then in quantitative research, you're often concerned with things like reliability and validity, whereas in qualitative work, we often speak of trustworthiness. And this refers to the evidence that your research findings are credible, transferable, confirmable, and dependable. And there again are many ways to do this, but some general things that you might want to consider doing in your qualitative study include triangulation. And this can be done by using a variety of methods, such as interviews and focus groups, or gathering data from different sources, or using different researchers. So member checking is just repeating back information and asking the participants in your study if your perceptions are accurate to their experience. Inter-rater reliability, so this can be calculated between researchers. Some actually, though, will argue that it's not necessary, as each researcher may bring his or her own unique but equally true perspective to the data. I think it's also important to have an audit trail. So this is just really keeping track of each step of the analysis and the rationale for any decisions made. And then representativeness of sample. So you want to document the characteristics of your selected sample to show that it was appropriate for your research question and to allow the reader to know which populations and settings your findings may be transferable to. And then finally, the demonstration of saturation, like we mentioned before. All right, so just finally, I'd just like to comment briefly on reporting guidelines, and big thanks to Dr. Gottlieb here for creating these QR codes for me. But here are two popular reporting guidelines for qualitative studies. And while there are some differences between the two, they really do contain a lot of similar elements. And I think it's really useful to review these guidelines before you even embark on your first study, but certainly while you're drafting your manuscript and prior to submission, just to make sure that you're including the major elements. All right, so that was my very brief cram a lot of information down your throat in 10 minutes time. But hopefully now you have a little bit more of a broader understanding of qualitative research. And if you have any questions, we can probably answer them in the breakout rooms.
Great. So we are going back out to breakout rooms. There are some questions which somebody can put in the chat, or you will find them on your worksheet, or you can just continue working on your projects that people are discussing and to talk more seriously about methods. And so we'll spend 15 minutes in this breakout room. All right, hope you all are working through various methods and techniques. We're going to move on to our next batch of techniques. And so we're going to talk about kind of survey design. And so if you're doing kind of evaluation or if you're doing specifically survey research, that'll be helpful. And then Teresa will talk about evaluation. And I'm going to pass it over.
Okay, you guys, Mike and I are going to spend a little bit of time talking about surveys. So let me go ahead and share my screen for you guys.
And Meg, yeah, there you go.
Okay. You guys seeing that okay? Yes. Okay. So we're going to run through some pearls and pitfalls of survey design. I know that in our small groups, it came up a couple of times about, oh, is survey the right way to approach this? So as we think through this, our first tip is to make sure survey really is the best approach to answer your research question. So first think about, what is your research question? Is this best answered by a survey? Or are you just doing this because it seems like it's the easiest way to answer your question, which is not a wrong reason to do it, but make sure it's going to get you the information you want. Surveys are usually easy to develop and pretty cost effective, so they're often an attractive approach, but it's important to consider what you really want to know if you can get that information from a survey. In our small group, we were talking about an example of you know, if you don't know what all of your responses are, you might need to do something before you can ask the survey, and we'll get to that in a second. So before you do the survey, make sure you do a thorough literature search. There's a few goals, I think, of your literature search. The first is that you want to see if you're proposing, if the question you're proposing has already been done by somebody else. And then secondly, and just as importantly, is that it can inform the content of your questions. So for example, say you want to identify like the wellness practices of your interns, of emergency medicine interns. Your first step is going to be to look in the literature to see if somebody has already published on this. And if not, you might want to look to literature to see if there's similar studies to inform your survey development. Say they've looked at this in another group of interns, internal medicine interns, for example, or ENT interns. In addition, you can use the information to build your questions and responses. So if you found a study saying that in ENT residents, pets help them cope, you want to make sure that you're in your survey, you're asking a question about pets. So you can really use your literature search both to see if it's been done before and then to inform your study. The next thing is that every question should have a purpose. So I know when I have made surveys, there's a lot of pressure to want to put every single question there that you could possibly want to know the answer to. And while it's helpful to make sure you're actually asking the questions you want to ask, you want to make sure that you're going to do something with the information you're getting. Survey fatigue is a real thing, and if you have a survey that's going to take people 20 minutes to do it, you might lose a lot of people after 5 to 10 minutes. And so after you've done your literature search and you've identified the domains you want to ask questions about, start to write your questions and then have somebody else review them. You may find that questions 4 and questions 8 are actually asking the same thing. So make sure each question will produce responses that are useful. Similarly, as you're writing your questions, try to predict all the possible responses to ensure that you get the full breadth of answers. There's nothing worse than asking, well, there might be other things that are worse, but in survey design, there's not many things that are worse than asking a question and realizing afterwards that you forgot a really important response. So say, back to our example of EM interns, say you asked a question of what are all the wellness practices that you've done, and you list 5 things, but you find out, gosh, that a significant other really is important and you didn't ask about that. You're not even going to know that information. Often it's not practical to have a completely exhaustive list. So if you're not sure what can be included, you can't find all the stuff in your literature review, you can always have an other box and then ideally followed by open text so they can put in a response. Mike, I can't remember. Am I still doing this one? Yeah, okay, good. So number 5 is using balanced anchors. So what this means, you've all seen the Likert scale, and John, I hope that you're still on and hear me saying Likert. Likert was a researcher here, and if you give John Burkhart more than 60 seconds to talk about it, you'll hear like an exhaustive history on Likert and how that's really his name, not Likert. But anyways, so balanced scales are more commonly used over unbalanced scales because they offer equal points of variation on either side of the neutral point. So this is like a 1 to 5 scale where you've got 1 and 2 are both, disagree, strongly disagree, and 3 is a neutral, and 4 and 5 are like the agree scales. This reduces the possibility of bias towards either of the end of the scale. That said, unbalanced scales can be useful sometimes. So if you know that most of your respondents feel a certain way about an issue, you might want to offer an unbalanced response scale so you can have greater points of variation in the spectrum that you know that that they're kind of swayed toward. This will give you a greater discrimination against your responses, but usually using balanced anchors is the best. All right, Mike.
Excellent. So moving on from there, validity and reliability. I think this is one of the challenges, and you mentioned earlier that a lot of times where the first thought is, well, why don't we just survey that and find out? And I think that's sometimes why surveys get relegated to the bottom of this mythical pyramid of evidence. And, oh, it's just a survey. It's not a randomized controlled trial. It's not that high. And I think the problem is that we just treat a survey as a really easy thing to do because it seems externally like something pretty easy. But when you're doing really good survey research to the level that it really elevates that, that to the level of other types of study designs, you have to assess validity and reliability. And so it comes in basically 3 main pieces. So you have content validity, you have response validity or response process validity, and then you have your reliability. So content validity is basically just looking at the content. Do we have content experts who are evaluating this to ensure this maps to all the literature, maps to what we want to actually assess? And ideally, someone with some survey expertise to look at this and say, yeah, this survey itself is well structured, well thought out, hitting on a lot of the really great points that Meg already laid out. So I think that's the first piece. And moving into the next slide, we'll talk about the other 2 pieces, which is response process and reliability. So this is really where the piloting comes in. First of all, if you're piloting a survey, it should be done probably in 2 versions. One is your pilot in person. This is just sitting down with someone or virtually sitting down with them and actually going through this to assess what's called response process validity. How much is their interpretation of the question mapping what you intended it to actually be? Usually what I'll do is I'll sit down and we'll have a couple of people stratified across institutions to get a variety of views and have them read the question and then do a little think aloud and say, okay, when you ask this question, this is how I interpret it. This is what I am assessing. This is how I would answer it based on my interpretation. Because it adds a much better understanding of things we take for granted. You stare at a paper long enough, you stare at a question long enough, it makes perfect sense to you. And we're often sometimes so siloed in that we may miss a misunderstanding of the question or just a different way to interpret it. So that in-person piloting becomes really important for that response process. Is it confusing? Does it have all the answers that they may want to answer? Is there typos or alignment errors or just something that will make it so you're going to have a loss of accuracy? And then the last one is probably the one that's most commonly not done, which is reliability. And so this is where you'll actually send out the survey to a small cohort of people and then see how data lines up. What is the inter-rater reliability or the inter-item reliability? Like how closely are these items matching? Are they matching to other gold standards if it's something we're assessing more of an outcome-based piece? And just how reliable is this survey data? And doing those 2 steps early, they do take a little more time, but it'll lead to a much more rigorous and much more accurate survey than just jumping into, here's something that made sense to us. These are the questions we want to ask and we're going to move forward. So investing in that early in those pilot steps of the in-person, as well as sending out a brief, to a small group is going to lead to a much more rigorous and much more likely to get accepted survey. Moving on to the 8th item, which is considering your target audience, just consider who you're trying to reach out to. We don't need to reach out to all people. Sometimes you want a more narrow spectrum, and you're going to get better response rates the more that you can narrow it down to a smaller group. It also makes it easier to assess your response rate, which we'll get to in a second, why that may or may not matter, but it's helpful to at least, you still have to be able to calculate it. So for example, I wanted to send a survey out to emergency physicians and I sent out the ASAP listserv. That's a really large group. No matter what, I'm not going to get a reasonable response rate. And it's going to be really hard to track because I actually have no idea how many people are on the listserv. Alternatively, if I said, I want to know about residency programs, so I'm going to target just the program directors. I know I have a very finite N, and I know what I'm reaching for. So the more you can kind of narrow that down to the people who you're looking for, the more it's kind of clear who you're targeting, and the easier it is to calculate like response rates. And that leads to the last one, which is our distribution plan. So traditionally, if you read survey research, you'll see some reference to Dillman or modified Dillman methods. This is a whole series of approaches that was originally from postage-based things, and a lot of it may not be relevant to the modern electronic media. Like no one, I think most of us are probably not mailing things to people's offices with stamped envelopes. We're kind of doing it through mostly online-based medium, but there are a lot of things you can pull from there. So some of the things that seem to work consistently well is if you know the person, they're more likely to respond. So try to reach out through social contacts, try to develop that connection. If you send one email, you're less likely to get a response than if you send 3. And you want to space them out. They generally recommend at least a day up to about 2 weeks. So somewhere in the time frame, I like a week, and I'll do like once a week for 3 weeks. But having some system where it goes more than once means that it doesn't end up in their spam or less likely ends up in their spam. They're more likely to see it. A lot of times the people who even want to respond may just forget about it. But if you send that follow-up, then they're more likely to respond. Make it as easy for them as possible. If you can try to have it directly into the email or a hyperlink that goes there, it's much easier than asking them to jump through a bunch of hoops. The more things you ask someone to do, the more complex it is, the less likely they're going to do it. There is some data in there for considering compensation. It's kind of interesting. If you actually give people money without even doing anything, people feel guilty when they complete the survey more than if you set up like a lottery system and said, if you complete this, you might win $50. The guilt factor actually seems to outweigh that. But in some form, if you can compensate people for the time, even a small amount, they're more likely to actually do the survey. And then the last thing is representativeness. And we talked about this in our small group a little bit ago, is the idea of everyone focused on the response rates. And traditionally 60% was this magical number that you had to achieve 60%. If you're at 61%, your survey is great. If you're at 59%, your survey is not adequate. And you'll still sometimes see that in some journals, but I think we're kind of moving pretty heavily beyond that numeric aspect, because you may have a group that's hard to reach. And if you can get a 40% response rate in a hard to reach group, as long as it's appropriately representative, it's probably better than a 60% or 70% response rate where you miss 30%, that's a clear focal group, and then you have a biased survey. So I would maybe step a little bit away from this pure numeric amount and assess instead, how representative is it? And there's a few ways you can do this. Traditionally, there's like 2 dichotomous tracks. So one is, how representative is your population? If I'm looking at residency programs, do I have a group of 3 and 4, academic and community and county? Do I have good geographic distribution? That's that population. And the second one is this assessment of respondents. And there's all sorts of interesting ways of assessing this. And I'll throw up a link in the chat shortly with a good resource for this. But one of probably the easier ways they can do this is this kind of wave analysis, where you just look at the first respondents who respond to the first email, and then those who respond to the second or third email, and the responses are pretty similar, then it's less likely that there's going to be a significant bias you may have missed. So those are, I think, some of my kind of key points from that distribution plan, which again, I'll tie back to follow good methods, send things more than once, use social connections, compensate for time, and then ensure representativeness.
All right, great, thank you. Any questions or anything for Megan, Mike?
What about using surveys as like a quiz as opposed to data collection? Like, what's the difference there?
So that's a really great question. There are some things that will be similar into there in terms of good survey design, being thoughtful about your question structure. But this is where you start to fall a little bit more into the assessing validity a little bit more rigorously. So you can look at, for example, Messick's framework or Kane and kind of assess some of the other aspects that we don't often think about in surveys. Some of them is comparing to a gold standard. You might also look at it in terms of consequential validity, like how much does this survey or this assessment matter? And that's often splits into both. How much does it force people to teach to the test? So am I actually going to skew people to learn things I don't really want them to? And the other aspect is this something that's going to be really profoundly impactful when it probably shouldn't? And I think step 2 is probably a really great example of that, or actually all the steps really, is that the degree to which it impacts it, is that really what it should be doing? I don't know, Meg, if you have other insights on that too.
No, that was well said. The only other thing that I would say about surveys, you guys, is that just as Mike said, when you're making sure you pilot them, try to send them to people who are representative of the people that you're going to be surveying. So if you are going to have, like if you're asking EM program directors, you might ask PEM program directors to pilot it, or IM program directors, something that has some similarities so that they can accurately reflect on it.
All right, we're going to move on to Teresa, and you can ask other questions when you get to your groups again. So Teresa, I'm going to talk about evaluation.
Hello. All right. So I'm just going to, I should have just replaced Spotlight, but I'll just remove everyone else. And all right. Hello, everyone. So program evaluation is one of those things that I like to do a little rant on. I was going to do slides, but I'm not sure they add anything. So I'm probably just going to speak if that's okay. If anyone needs any further clarification and things like that, I'm happy to have that. To me, program evaluation is about really, for those of us who do more educational design, understanding if something worked. And so for me, I think one of the big challenges is that sometimes people are, but is that research? And my answer is actually no, it's not research. And that's mind-blowing for some people, because I think sometimes we try to sell some of our work as research when it's actually not. And so acknowledging that it's not allows us to then have different affordances, because I would say program evaluation is rigorous scholarship, but it's not research. And to have that discussion a little bit, I'm going to ask everyone to hit the chat and write down why they don't, why am I saying that? Why is program evaluation not research? Think about the Tuskegee trials, think about other program evaluations that you might have done for health systems. What is the difference between program evaluation and research? And I am going to give a couple of seconds for you to ponder that and write something down. And the teachers are not immune from this. So go ahead and reflect if you're one of the co-teachers in the MedEd bootcamp. You can also give them a head start. Let's say in about 3 minutes, if the people who are studying with us today don't have an answer, then one of the teachers can type. Hypothesis testing, yeah. Wouldn't be ethical, withholding training from a learner. Yeah, the ethics are important, right? Internal assessment, it's not adding to the literature. Well, it depends, maybe. That's why I'm saying, Kat, it might be that it's scholarship still, because maybe it's novel enough that would add to the literature. I am likely biased, yes, Guy. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, data collected, not usually collected with an eye on publications. Sometimes it might not be. You're right, Casey. Any other thoughts? We'll let the teachers pipe in as well. I'd love to hear their opinions, because there are some opinions here that are divergent from my own.
I think you could design a random, you could design a curriculum that would put people in different groups and ask a research question, and the evaluation of the program might be then considered to be research. So I think it's there's a gray zone in between.
There's a gray zone, exactly. So that's the divergent opinion, is that if you're doing something, then sometimes evaluating 2 different programs at once might be actually research. I agree with that, Sally. Any other thoughts? It's okay, there's really good answers here. So I'm going to run with it. I would say that the key difference is really about, and it comes back to ethics, and it's why some big health systems and medical education interventions, such as some of the call roster work that's been published in New England and other things like that, aren't always considered research, and are not always considered by institutional review boards to need actual ethical oversight. Is truly, it's about the ethics of it. So for me, if you're doing something to a group of people, like you are introducing something new for the sake of learning what the outcome would be, that is the reason why ethics and ethics review boards and institutional review boards have been introduced in at least North American settings. I would say that some of the we are haunted still by Tuskegee. We are haunted still by the atrocities that the Nuremberg trials, brought to light, right? And the reason why is because we didn't want scientists going and doing stuff to people without oversight that might be unethical and be dangerous. Similarly, I think that most medical schools would say that, like if we are doing this just to see how the medical students will react to it, that's probably not, like, that needs to be governed by ethics, right? Like we're just trying to find something new. The difference in the ethics of something that's considered then program evaluation is that it really comes down to the purpose of the program evaluation. Like some people stated, it's not always that you're trying to publish something. You're actually just you're coming at it from a different ethical point of view, which is that you are truly just concerned about whether the program that you just implemented, that you were going to do come hell or high water, actually was worthwhile. If it's a waste of time, if it's dangerous, if it's all these other things, does it have intended and unintended consequences? Does it actually hit the mark? Is it costly? Is it too cumbersome for the faculty? All of those questions that come out of, I did this thing, and then I want to look and see if it had effects. That is actually the moral imperative there, is that you should check. Because if you introduce something new to a very complex system, like a medical school or a postgraduate program or a graduate program, guess what? You're probably spending people's time, money, sometimes their emotions on actually implementing that. And probably you're spending some of your hair, or at least turning it gray, by implementing some of these changes. And the idea would be that you should probably check to see if that was worthwhile. If the 17 gray hairs that you got from changing the way that conference day worked were worth it. Was it worth the cost savings of moving everyone to Zoom, for instance, et cetera, right? Like these are the things that are worthwhile checking on the other side when you are someone who's a leader and someone who is a program coordinator, leader, someone who can actually affect curricular change. And there is, again, that gray zone in between, because then it basically says that someone who has access to change a curriculum could do scholarship under the guise of program evaluation. So to be very, very cautious and involve stakeholders and other people to make sure you're not just turning your program into a little lab, but that you are truly asking the right questions, being fulsome, being judicious in what you are evaluating. And if in that evaluation it is, let's say, fruitful for you to publish your findings, being very clear when you do so in the original work that you're publishing that it is program evaluation, that it is not research, because you should probably try not to spin something that is program evaluation into research. You can get in trouble for that, both by the journals on the back end, but also just people get confused by what you're trying to do, and so they will evaluate you unfairly with different reporting standards and guidelines. Okay. Now, in terms of understand the ethics of it, like the question that I take myself back to is, was I gonna do this? Is this program that I'm introducing, this new system that I'm actually introducing, is it in the best interest of the learners? And will people be worse off if I don't implement it regardless? And if it's for various reasons the best way forward, or it might be that someone like in Canada, at least the Royal College told us to do so. If it's something that the decision has already been made, then to me, that is something that is definitely more aligned with program evaluation. And on the flip side, if it's something that you're like, oh, we should really do this, and let's put it into our curriculum because I want to find out the answer. If that's where your set point is, then that probably is research. And the moral of the story is that sometimes you don't get to make that decision. Your institutional review board is probably the group that you need to actually hit up. So definitely reach out to them, develop a bit of a rapport with them, go to them with every knowing question. Because on the back end, if you do a research project by accident, let's say, and then you go and try to publish it, the journal editors will definitely not look favorably on you. They will not like the fact that you did research without ethical approval. So it's really important to sort it out. And I am fairly liberal with asking our ethics board chairs for opinions. Like I send them drafts of even program evaluation surveys and other things like that. So I think it's worthwhile to consider all of that when you're going forward. And I think it looks like someone just pasted a whole big chat thing about surveys. Okay, cool. It's probably not relevant. I will put in a similar block of text in a little bit about program evaluation styles. The three big ones that I would say that are out there, and you can always come to our workshops tomorrow to learn a little bit more about them, but I'd say that the three big ones that are out there would be Kirkpatrick is definitely used a lot in program evaluation, not just research. In fact, Kirkpatrick is a program evaluation framework from industry. So like, I think they looked at factories and stuff like that and originally. So Kirkpatrick for sure is one of the big dominant frameworks in program evaluation. Another dominant framework in program evaluation is actually something called the logic model, where you're basically looking at a model of what you intended to put in the program, and then you look at outcomes to see if people had those outcomes. So those are the intended consequences and then the unintended consequences, right? And then the third one is one that I like quite a bit is the realist framework. It's more of a qualitative for those of you who identify more as constructivist leaning individuals. Realist evaluation, which is by two guys named Pawson and Tilley, Pawson and Tilley, Tilley, like the hat company. Those two had created a framework. They're from the social sciences. They had studied people in jail and recidivist programs and created a new way to look at mixed and qualitative approaches to understanding so what works for whom and when. So the idea would be you might have the same intervention, but run 4 different people through it and you'd have different outcomes. What they realized that it probably has an intersection with the context that they came from and who they are. The mechanism itself may have been held stable, but then the outcomes could be very different. So for instance, in their situation, it was that there were, 4 different people who went to a recidivism prevention program around education of inmates in a jail. And one of them was someone low socioeconomic status will go back to a neighborhood full of gangs. One was, white collar criminal who does iBanking as their day job. And the third one is someone who hit someone by accident, was, for manslaughter, the vehicular homicide kind of thing. And the last one is a first-time offender of a major drug deal. And each one of these people, if they were run through the same program because of what context they go back to, and what end up would dictate different outcomes. So that one I think is quite interesting as well. And there are other ones like the REAIM framework and other things from public health. There's a whole slew of different mechanisms that can use, but I just wanted to sensitize you to a couple different ones so you can fall down the rabbit hole to understand some of these more as well. I'm going to challenge everyone to take a look at the primer that Mike has just put in, because I think that's actually a really good paper. The other thing I would suggest is if the teachers would like to join me in this as well, if you want to go and look at, or if you have a paper that comes to mind that you think is a really good program evaluation paper, go ahead and throw it in the chat right now as well.
All right, we're gonna break out into breakouts. Yep. All right, so we're going out to breakout groups. We're gonna do like just 10 minutes, and we'll bring you back after that, and then we'll do kind of a panel question piece. And so, kind of back to your projects, apply survey and or evaluation, or just
recording the breakout room for CME reasons. All right, so let's go through it a little bit, and hopefully Karen can join us, because I know she's kind of juggling all the things, probably like every other woman on a Zoom conference. They're probably dealing with putting up fires other places at the same time. All right, so maybe Lauren, you could like think through Kieran's like scenario, and then we could catch her up where you were thinking about it as a medical student with a different lens as well, right? So you can maybe adopt hers for now. All right, so Sarah Lynn, do you want to take us through kind of some conceptual frameworks that you've toyed around with or thought about with regards to your app, with regards to some of the things, and maybe we can spitball with you a little bit to brainstorm.
I guess I'm obviously not an expert. I'm learning a lot of the theory, but I always like the constructivist sort of approach, is that people have to build their own knowledge, because I've always taken the approach that you provide the framework for them to make the connections, and then part of your job is to sort of help interleave a lot of those connections. And so taking it from different, always you just say, you should look at the same elephant from different points of view.
Got it. I love
So
it.
they can begin to put together that it's an elephant that has a tail and it has a nose and it has this. And for full disclosure, I'm a medical toxicologist, so I teach some very difficult concepts. And so part of my framework is to teach it in different, let's say anion-gap metabolic acidosis, and I really want them to understand some concepts about osmolar gap and anion gap in the context of toxic alcohols. There may be very different frameworks, and I take trying to sort of build that knowledge and interleave that knowledge so that they build their own connections versus me building it for them, because I find that memorization never really works for when you're having to problem solve for the patient in front of you. So thinking in terms of sort of the app, it's a little bit more challenging, I think, because I'm not having direct educational influence other than just trying to use a tool to help people begin to recognize that they need to learn the knowledge. So it makes sense, as opposed to actually, can I test that they've acquired the knowledge other than looking at it from a system standpoint? Because then it's like using this tool of, or here's a scenario, what do you worry about? Here's, this is malignant hyperthermia. In addition to calling this number to reinforce the behavior that you're trying to get them to do, help them identify that there's a problem. So it's a little bit harder, I think, from that constructivist point of view.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you declare it, because I think these theories actually play into the way that we might actually design our systems too, because the app that you just described was the post-positivist, there's a right answer kind of approach. And I think that by declaring what kind of your teaching philosophy, now I'm like, are you sure you want to build the app the way that you do? It's convenient, but it may not give you the sense of that constructivist leaning that you may be craving. And so to take a step back then and say, if we were to use a constructivist lens, how might we go to Lauren and say, okay, so you want to drill yourself on emergencies. How might we build in learner agency, let's say? So that might be a theoretical framework you bring in to say, or self-determination theory. How do we let Lauren decide she's going off to cardiology block, right? Like this flash forward to Lauren and as an intern, right? Like she's a first year resident and she's doing all her different like tour guide kind of like rotations, I call them. And she's touring through all the guest starring on other shows and not ER for a little while. And so as she does her crossover episode into, like the poison center, right? How might she trigger the call for help just in time learning? Like how might she, if she were to switch into general surgery, because she's like, I've had enough, I'd rather be a surgeon. And now she's on the show Grey's Anatomy. I know, I'm just joking a little bit, but the idea would be, as Meredith Grey, what does she now need in terms of surgical emergencies? So that might actually inform both your design and unfurl some perspectives, right? So that I think the conceptual frameworks are are very, very useful, not just as theories, but as guiding principles to help you remember when you're building things, what it looks like. But then that experience sometimes triggers more interesting research. Sarah Lynn, you might find it very interesting to go and explore design-based research as a whole paradigm for the kind of work that you're doing. The ecosystem stuff that you're talking about really aligns well with that, because you might want to think about different use cases in the different ecosystem and then build for those use cases. And there's some books on it that I can share with you, and I'll put it as a link to the Google Doc. That might be useful to you.
I think that's the challenge is availability of options can be quite limited, right? And so you have to use things that are already constructed in the system, because there's not usually a lot of funding to create new things.
Yeah, but I think that once you actually, when you think through the use cases, you could pilot it on a Google Doc, you could pilot on, like you don't have to use big fancy. Google Form will actually give you the prototype you need. PowerPoint slides can give you the interface look so you can understand what people want and then build it properly when you actually get the money to build, right? So I think there's a lot of hack arounds that you might be able to do when you're thinking through, the use-inspired design. Like you can, again, you can, and I think that collaboration is really key here. You might be able to link up with the computer science people. There might be a thesis student looking for a side gig and or a thesis project because they're not sure what they're going to do. So there's some ways to kind of link up sometimes with other people that are nearby as well.
I was gonna say, like, if you're assessing, I don't know what app you'd use, but like assessing like over like a series of quizzes, like I know you're saying you want them to be able to get the right answer, but there is a way to go back and see like what people's first answers was, and so like kind of look, okay, are they getting the answer correctly like sooner, like if that makes sense, versus like taking 4 tries like at the start and then like by the end they're like getting the right answer, on the first try or second try, like kind of seeing that and just going back through, because they're still getting the right answer eventually, but knowing kind of how quickly it takes them to get it.
But part of that is also your question design, right? Because I can make it so everybody gets the right answer the first time.
Right.
Just trying to figure it out. But as I get to what I want them to be able to do is to say, okay, in this clinical scenario, because I could say, what number do you call, and have the one same number that they need to call every single time. And they're like, oh yeah. So I reinforce the identification of the number behavior, but not necessarily did they recognize that this person needs additional help. And then that's the thing is thinking more ecosystem as opposed to this is emergency medicine base. This is everyone in the hospital base, both, and then thinking initially it's rolling this out for the MDs and then rolling this more for the nursing, because the nurses are the ones who identify the patient and call someone, right?
Super interesting. So I might suggest that in the patient safety literature, there's some interesting conceptual frameworks there, because I think that people have quantified, for instance, in the past, how many pre-codes, whatever you call them, race, we call them race calls.
We have like rapid responses.
Yeah, exactly. So you could actually say, we think that if we do this right, we should have a 20% increase in rapid resuscitation calls and actually less trips to the ICU. So you could say 10% drop, whatever you think the effect size is based on maybe other comparable interventions. So that then you're inviting in conceptual frameworks from quality improvement and patient safety, right? And so that's why I think the frameworks are important, because it helps you look at the lens, just like if I was coming at it from a medical, like if a poison control case, you can be looking at it from a biochemist point of view. You could look at it from a clinician's point of view. You can go at it from a psychiatrist's point of view. Each of those points of view will give you that different vantage point on that same problem. Similarly here, the patient safety people will have a different vantage point on what the outcomes should be and give you that lens. And so looking at how they actually quantified, I don't think mortality necessarily will be the years.
Well, we're hoping not to get there.
But a mortality drop, I would imagine that would actually be the end goal of this magic system, would be someday you have many pre-arrests or pre-alerts, and you follow and it never gets worse. Similar to like an early warning system for trainees, right? I'd rather pick them up in PGY1, diagnose their learning disorder, and then they fly through the rest of residency. Right? I don't want them to fail in 5th year. So I predict that if I do it right and we have an early warning system for trainees, that we would increase our remediation rate, but decrease our number of failures by X number of %, right? And so that would be a very post-positivist quantitative perspective on it, but not necessarily bad, right? And then if you wanted to apply a constructivist lens from the point of view of not the social constructivist lens for learning, but rather constructivist lens for understanding the truth, you might do focus groups with mixed nursing, first-year residents after each pre-code and send them like a little survey with free text to say, how did it feel to call for help? And then see, well, it was just like in the app. In fact, you could imagine someday if you got the capital, because you're going after patient safety money, which is a different pool of money and has more money, you might be able to actually build an app that actually within the app, not just the learning module, the app is the module to phone a friend to actually, you know, to actually be part of the, so you could make it so that when Lauren's a PGY1, she practices on the app calling for help and working through fake scenarios. And then when she's a first year resident on call, she knows how to use the app, so the app becomes the phone a friend, and she phones real friends this time. Right. And so if you do it that way, oh my gosh, this is a game changer development that you could study each of these interventions to see as you stepwise build onto the app modules, because that's how the software would be built. You could check along the way with each PDSA cycle and write each one up. Pretty exciting if you use a design-based research paradigm. For overall for stepwise, right? Because then you could look at quality improvement in terms of the user interface sucks. So you pull Lauren and all her friends into a focus group and get Kieran involved and say, okay, how would you make this user interface better? And they're like, well, we need a chat. And we're like, oh, why? And then you explain that, and then you put it all together, right? So, and then you actually say, this is how we, and the app and the chat is now used by 60% of people. And it's really important. And this is how they're doing some of their curbside teaching and learning and even consultation. And then you quantify that, right? So you could, for every step of your ecosystem build, be testing some variables, learning more about it, and then writing it up.
It's interesting to think about from, getting feedback on sort of the app piece. It goes back to Kieran's sort of question of how to really use qualitative data.
Exactly, right? Like Uber drivers or whatever, like you can make it so that it's, very similar to the interface. Like how fast was the rapid response team? Were they fast enough for you? Were they helpful, right? Here's a pick list of 32 descriptors or 5 descriptors that are most commonly used, right? Confrontational, like if they put thumbs down, confrontational, patronistic, paternalistic, patronizing, insulting. On the upside, you might be like, how good was the service? And you give them a thumbs up, and that gives you different words that say, so you could really get into the nitty gritty here. And there is research paradigms that get really into that, like deep dive of, should it have a thumbs up button or should it be a check mark green button, right? Like there's like all these things you can get really further down, or again, you can zoom out and look at it as an ecosystem. And so it might be that each one of these little things becomes, if you solve the graduate student problem that Kieran has, or maybe you do write for a grant so that you can have your first 2 grad students, you zoom them into this module of the app, and you keep building, right, and iterating. All right, Kieran, we're going to flip over to you. Thanks for joining us. Do you want to, with conceptual frameworks, do you want to think through that a little bit with us? Like what you've picked, the constructivist paradigm is your interests, and you've got a little bit of a conceptual framework around needs assessment. Can you maybe clarify a little bit more of your point of view for what kind of model you're looking at for the need?
Yeah, we were thinking of actually using Think's taxonomy as a framework for analyzing the discussion posts. The reason we like it is because it includes some more of the human element about the affective component, people's emotions. And
do you want to tell us a little bit more about the framework? Because I think I have actually fleetingly heard about it, but I'll admit I don't know, and Sarah Lynn and Lauren might not know either.
Oh yeah, sure. I definitely don't know that much about it. I'm just starting to learn about it myself, but basically it's sort of a framework about thinking about learning as 6 categories. One is, a lot of them are, I think, pretty intuitive. Foundational knowledge, which is, just about content, like information or ideas, just understanding them. Then there's application of that information, that knowledge. So skills, critical thinking, managing projects. Then a third is integration, which is, it's described as connecting ideas and people or realms of life. I don't know too much about that part. And then there's learning how to learn, which, you know, is a big focus, at least in our curriculum revision that's going on here at Columbia. You know, it's really trying to focus less on delivering knowledge and skill content and more on teaching students how to continue learning, you know, for their whole lives, and to be self-directed learners, and to, you know, become a master adaptive learner. So that's the fourth category. And the other two categories are the ones that I think are also really helpful. One is the human dimension. So learning about oneself, and learning about other people, which I think that a lot of the discussion posts were about professional identity development. And so we find that to be a really big theme in the content, different aspects just about roles and responsibilities of themselves as the medical student on the team, but then also the roles and responsibilities of a lot of different team members. You know, as you know, EM is a team sport, and so they interact with all these different people in the clinical setting. And so just learning about those other people, their motivations, you know, the interpersonal interactions. And the sixth and final dimension of this taxonomy is about caring. So it's about feelings, interests, values, and certainly, you know, the bulk of the discussion board content was about that, because, you know, the point of it was to be very open in letting the students write about whatever they wanted to. So rather than giving them very directed prompts or topics, we left it very open. And so, you know, so clearly they chose to write about things that they cared about or were interested in, just because of the design of the curricular element. So, so that's why I think that taxonomy might be really helpful, you know, to look at the framework. And you know, a piece that I just wanted to emphasize was this idea that professional identity development seems to be this really huge theme. And so maybe looking at that particular aspect in more detail as a framework. That's another, you know, way I think of looking at it.
Okay, that's great. Any reactions from Sarah or Lauren? Does it seem like there's a lot of theories? Because that was what I was going to say. I was like impressed, definitely, Kieran, that's a lot of deep thinking you're doing. And I have definitely fallen down a theory rabbit hole before. What I would try to do though, is try to figure out how you can coalesce some theories, because I'll be honest with you, if you have something that's very theoretically complex, reviewers and editors don't tend to like it, because a lot of authors have trouble with understanding how all the theories coalesce. I would say that the most amount of theories I'd be able to cram into one paper would be if I did a qualitative, more grounded theory approach. I might have 2 or 3 sensitizing concepts that might allude to some of the ways that I looked at the data, but even then it was a like pulling teeth to get people to be okay with it. And they were pretty simple concepts too. They were like growth mindset, which is only 2 things, and then another thing, and one more thing. And then you would be like, each of those afforded different lenses, and we amalgamated them into one kind of bigger thinking, and created a theoretical framework around it. But at the same time, it's one of those things where it's hard to get published in the end when you have that much complexity. Not to say that you can't have complexity when you're building, like Sarah, then your ecosystem is going to have so many theories that drive every part of it, right? It's just that there's a bit of a cultural paradigm towards simplicity when it comes to our writing. So I would just put that out there as one of the challenges.
One of the other thoughts that we had was maybe just trying to link the content to the EPAs, and maybe that might be more accessible or interesting to the audience. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's okay too. Like, it's an organizing framework. It's easier to analyze, right? Like, it'd be when someone is pretty familiar with the EPAs and things like that. You could have EPA and then plus maybe like 2 or 3 things. That's how I might use a dominant framework, and then add a little bit on the extra, right? Like the PIF stuff, you could have that as a big bucket, for instance, right? I don't know. that might be easier for people. Like, so imagine Lauren is your target audience of reading this. She's like interested to understand how people use asynchronous chatting because she wants to talk her med school into deploying at her shop, right? The idea would be that she needs to understand, okay, yeah, but the EPAs are a big thing for me. And then after that, how would I add on a little bit of like, yeah, I get professional identity is important as a med student, things like that. And so you might find it easier to communicate that way, I would think. I don't know, Lauren, what's your perspective?
I mean, I agree with that. Yeah, it's kind of hard to get everyone to communicate at once, like at the same time. So kind of giving them the option to be involved, but different, like.
Okay. All right. So any maybe Kieran, you had that question about how to bring people into the fold with regards to funding sources and things. And I don't know that there's a secret magic bullet. What I would say is that it's often cobbled together with a team. So I might be making kind of like a, like forming a small team around this interdisciplinary. I mean, you're at an Ivy League institution, so it might help for you to reach across to other disciplines because they might be excited to play ball with you around some of this stuff, and there might be grad students looking to carve a niche out, make an impression, so that they can have a good professional profile when they're applying for jobs or postdocs and things like that. So it might be that you can involve other highly qualified professionals that are looking for side gig type stuff. Another source of inspiration and workforce would be if there are, I don't know if your school has medical student summer research ships, or scholarships. That might be a good way to kind of engage, and then talking to people to form this as a research question so that they could do the sorting of the comments and things like that as well.
Right.
And then trainees, right? So like senior trainees, like people who are junior faculty or senior fellows, or people who are interested in med ed might be another cachet of groups. You do have a satellite campus of the Maastricht master's program, so that might be a group of people to maybe get a note out to. But if you're looking for a side project aside from your thesis, or looking to work on something, that might be something. I think that's at your shop. Maybe that's NYU actually. No, that's NYU, but there are other groups that you could reach out to maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely go through like the emergency medicine interest groups. I know when I was trying to find a research project, like my first year, it was super awkward, like trying to reach out to people because I'm super interested in research, but there was no one place like telling me what projects were available or things like that. And so they kind of put it all on the students. So I don't know how it is at your guys' universities, but if you just like find the president of the interest group and be like, hey, here's this project, they would much easier be able to put that out to like people who are actually interested, rather than you just getting a student who just wants research and doesn't really care about emergency. Because you're going to get those if you just put it out general, but if you generally focus it towards like the people who are interested in emergency medicine, you might have more luck.
That sounds great. Thanks for all the good ideas.
Right. So I think we're going to go back out to the big room and then take a break. So we're a smaller group. The other groups need more time because there's more of them, but you get the intense, close personal touch here. And so maybe we'll jump back out into the big room and then we can go for a break. You can take a break from here too. They'll close the breakout rooms eventually. So you can, but just so you know where we're at in the schedule. Okay. See you back in a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So, Karen, are you there?
Hi, everybody. I'm Patty. I'm replacing Laura for now. I'm the other MSA, so nice to meet you.
There we go. We have Kieran times 2 now. All right. So
Can you
yeah.
see me now?
Yeah.
I've got an echo. Hold on. How about now?
Yeah, you're just gonna have to stop audio on one of the 2 devices. So let me see if I can.
Yeah, I muted myself on the laptop, but maybe I'll mute myself on this one too.
Yeah. Kieran, you can probably just use your phone. Anyway, okay. All right, how are we gonna work this? What do you guys want to work on next? So right now we've talked about methods and we've explored some things. We've kind of bandied around your topics so far. Kieran, it sounds like you have picked qualitative methods. Do you want to go into process orientation, how you decided that, and maybe talk to us a little bit more in depth about your methods?
So why did we pick the methods that we picked? Well, it's a little different from what was just described in the talk in terms of designing a qualitative study, because the idea for doing this qualitative analysis came after the curricular element was already completed. So it wasn't, so we didn't, thinking about things like, like how to design the intervention in such a way that then you would be addressing sample size, and things like that are not part of, this particular project, just because we already, had the students go through the course and participate. And after the fact, we just said, wow, this is really rich data. We should do something with this, with all this content that we have. So I think that there are a few limitations there, in terms of what we can get out of it, because it's not going to necessarily be designed in such a way that we have, accounted for all of the things that could bias the data, the outcomes. But at the same time, I think that, there's just a lot of information there. And so, we were thinking about, I think it's a lot easier to do a quantitative type of, analysis. I think that we could have, just like conducted a survey with some, multiple choice or Likert questions or something like that. But we just thought that the content is so rich that we wanted to just have it be more about, generating hypotheses. And so that's how we sort of decided to go the qualitative route.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you're practical about what inspires you, right? You're flitting around in what's called Pasteur's quadrant, use-inspired research, right? You've used something and then you're inspired by it and then you're researching it, right? It's a little bit of a loop that you'll walk between, like developing things and then actually, I mean, with all the vaccine craze, it's important for you to waltz between, the practical implementation of getting it out of the labs and actually into arms. And you also need to do the stuff that allows us to have a COVID vaccine, right? So Pasteur talked like quite a bit about that, right? And so the idea of use-inspired research, I think, is really important as an applied scientist and an educator, because you will waltz between applying your craft and then maybe thinking of a new question that appeals to you because of the application you just created. So I think waltzing between those 2 worlds is really important. Sarah Lynn, any thoughts on and reflections from the way that Kieran's been thinking about it?
I think it's always interesting when you're trying to sort of, you see something you want to pursue and then just trying to, and I think one of the things from the discussion is like, okay, how do I investigate that further when there is no gold standard in the world of education?
Yeah. And so, I mean, Kieran, I think what you're coming at it from is more practical, like program evaluation kind of framing in terms of what you do. And so being able to situate yourself within that, it's kind of like, you know, those Russian dolls that have, like, as you unpack it, like there's more and more layers. And as much as I say, okay, we got to be mindful of how we throw theory at people in our papers, you also have to acknowledge that it is probably multifactorial and that you're doing a lot of stuff. So situating yourself in, this is an opportunity to do program evaluation that informs future needs, or to looking at from a needs assessment. Like sometimes we're not always sure what med students are thinking. So this is a portal into their thinking. So looking at other use cases for like these kind of data. That spin is still a conceptual or theoretical orientation, right? It's still that I see this tactically as something we could zoom out on and be able to use this as in a novel way to conduct needs or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. Similarly with Sarah Lynn, the work that you're working on, you know, how do you use institutional data to inform, you know, app development? That's, you know, it's novel still, right? Like it's how do you actually link those two things, and then how might you then, you know, use some kind of discovery work. Maybe it is more qualitative, maybe it's a combination or mixed methods. So you could survey people first and then maybe do some focus groups or interviews of, okay, so now you've worked with the app. Well, how could we make this app better? Well, how could we help it move the mark? Actually ask people like Patricia, who might be a resident someday in your system, right? The idea would be, okay, Patricia, you've played with the app for 6 months now. What do you see as ways that we can move forward to, you know, use this app to, if think big, dream big, tell us what you would want it to do, right? So I'm sure this happens.
Initiative inquiry, as you say.
I mean, you know, and then seeing, right? Because that's would be where what you, at that point, when you're doing those kind of things, you might bring in, you know, Kieran and say, okay, this is the qual perspective. I'm using this to inform further development work in the area. You know, what are your thoughts? Are there concepts or theories? You know, so she'll have been a little bit ahead of you in that journey. And so that's, I don't know, to me, that's where the power of connecting people is, you know. And Kieran, are you?
The challenge is figuring out how to capture that into something that you can actually analyze as opposed to just describe.
Yeah, and sometimes the analysis can be different levels of deep, right? It could be, like Kieran said, it can be more like descriptive, kind of like what are the actual, like, you know, like sometimes when you do design thinking kind of concepts, people tell you all the requirements, like use requirements. If you talk to people who do development of software, they're always looking for what are the technical requirements that we need to build. Because for a software designer, they want to know how many buttons you need. That's really important, right? But I think that where we can come in with a middle lens is actually to say, okay, but what is the educational psychology? I would say, if we make this button like here versus on this other screen versus over here, you could play around with some of those things. And that infinitely is, that's actually, those kind of things, little tweaks there, that's when you can really get into the quant. Or you might actually, they call it A&B testing in website design, for instance. But literally sometimes our airline, back when it was airlines were a thing we used, or Google, sometimes they'll have two designs of a website, and half of us will be randomized into one condition to see if we end up clicking the buy now button versus the other group that the buy now button is where it usually is. And so they actually do like massive RCTs with thousands of users because they want to know if we're clicking the clickbait. And so there still are, so the right question is, how do we best design this to monetize or customize a website or an app to, you know, increase the number of calls, for instance, Sarah Lynn, and for help, right? That can be an RCT-able question, like, and it is still within our paradigm of, well, do it this way or this way, and you know, all things are equal on the back end. Or maybe it's two designs of the app to see how you could drive interest in the app. Half the group gets randomized into a condition where they have teams, you know, gamified, where they get points if they, you know, as a team they work better, and they can message each other and phone a friend and ask for help with questions they don't know. And the other group could have no functionality like that. It's just what is like Tetris style, single person, like going through all the questions. you can see what the level of engagement, how many people, how many more clicks there are in one group versus the other, right? So that's why I think that once you're actually in the weeds of doing some development work, you can think of questions that if you have your research brain or the research brain setting flipped on as an optional layer on, you can see these questions as you start to develop what you do. Does that make sense?
We actually came up with a survey to survey the students, all sorts of questions about the discussion board, asking them some quantitative questions, Likert scale type questions about, how useful it was, and whether they remembered what they wrote about, whether they remembered what their peers wrote about, and then some open-ended, qualitative type questions where we just asked them about, how it impacted their learning more long-term, and, all of this stuff, because we wanted to show the impact of the curricular element. And unfortunately, most of the students said that they don't really remember. So the timing was off. So it's kind of, but I think that, if we were able to do it closer to when they actually were engaging in the course, then it might be interesting to get some of those answers.
Yeah, sometimes medical school is a big blur, right? So that's even that part is really cool when you're thinking about redesigning your study. We aren't at that, we're kind of at that stage, I guess, because we're not really doing too much more of that. What I would suggest is that you think about beta testing your surveys or your focus groups with non-participatory people in your team or people who are comparable. So, now that you made a new friend in Patricia, you might be able to say, hey, Patricia, imagine you had like you just had your AM rotation 3 weeks ago and there was a discussion board and you participate in it, could you answer these questions? And then you actually get on Zoom with her and watch her fill it out. And she's like, and say, can you talk aloud? Like, thanks. And you'd be surprised. People are like, I really don't know. And I really can't answer. And this question doesn't make any sense to me. And then that's called cognitive testing. Cognitive testing is like the Cadillac criteria. When I see someone's done a survey with cognitive testing as an editor of several meta journals, I'm like, excellent. And they get bonus points just by mentioning that stage. And so people talk about pilot testing, but this is, to me, a really important step. And I have actually used this in some of my more recent survey designs, even for program evaluation surveys, and answers are just better. The answers end up being better because you look through the lens of someone who is seeing it for the first time and you're like, oh yeah, that's confusing. They're like, why is this section before that section? That makes no sense. You're like, yeah, good point. And then a couple of PDSA cycles and you all of a sudden have a better survey and maybe less questions usually, because people are like, this is going on forever. and then you get that impression. Sarah Lynn, thoughts?
I think that's one of the things that I find, like when I do item writing first tests, is, you think you're testing one thing and it turns out, let's say your high performers don't do, and you're like, oh, so there's something about this that's just not logical. And I think I learned this lesson one time when someone handed me a phone that they wanted me to test some little app thing for the School of Medicine. And I said, okay, where are the instructions? It's like, we don't want to give you instructions. We just want to see you interface with it and see how logical it is for a frontline user. And it was probably the smartest thing I'd ever had seen done. The only problem is my phone was so old at the time that it wouldn't work. And they were like, oh, well, that's a problem. I was like, okay, so they had to give me another phone.
Well, they found one problem at least.
To beta test, but it helped them to like, oh, well then, not everybody has the most up-to-date, whatever phone, et cetera, that can actually run this app. And then watching me navigate it, I think was probably the most helpful thing they did. And so that sort of beta testing and sort of piloting is a very important step, because many times you think you have the right question or approach or et cetera. And then someone who's like not knowing the outcome is like, So how do I find the person on this again? So you want me to answer this, or it's very helpful. And I think it's also challenging with, like you said, with medical students, because they're so done. They just kind of close that piece of their world and they just move on to the next. So you have to capture them so often real time.
And then when you do a pilot testing like that, then sometimes you have new questions that pop up. Maybe the student experience is insufficient because they are moving on to general surgery and they're going to forget everything that happened. And so the impact may not be so obvious to them. And so who are other stakeholders that might find that what you did on this rotation affects their rotation, for instance, and finding out who those other stakeholders are and what the other use cases of your intervention are and who might be downstream affected. Impact can be shown by many different players probably within the health system, right? I mean, I think it'd be very interesting if you always have set rotations that, general surgery always follows emergency medicine. Could you imagine that, a time series would be that you could actually somehow randomize it so that they went to ortho or something like that first. And so you could see if people, I don't know, called for help better after they went from one rotation to the other. And then the call rate is higher for calling your phone a friend or something like that, for your senior resident, and you could actually track that, right? Like that's, to me, that's pretty cool.
That's sort of an interesting question. If the order in which people are placed affects their behavior, the desired behaviors.
Yeah, so that's where I think the conceptual frameworks, the theories, they help you pick those things up. I don't know. I like sometimes thinking about both of you are more practically minded. So in terms of the paradigms that might work would be looking things like logic model to kind of understand, like if you intended the curricular outcome of this rotation to be this, right? Kieran, it might be that you can do a program evaluation to have people submit a reflection, a draft maybe of their candidate statement for an application to residency before, and then you look at whether or not, after, a certain amount of time after your discussion board, you could ask them to submit something again after, and then you could actually look and see if there was a change qualitatively. And then you could even do it mixed methods by seeing if it correlates, those that change more in the way that they're thinking about the professional identity. Did they post more? Did they interact more with the PIF kind of like content? Did they engage in those discussions more, right? These are the kind of things that might be worthwhile to think about, like, and that's where you can start getting into some of the weeds if you really want to chase that down, right?
Yeah, one of the things that we were thinking about that relates to what you guys are discussing is that we were thinking about seeing if the themes that are brought up by the students evolve over the course of the major clinical year, because we would imagine that, their professional identity development really grows a lot over those 12 months. And so just thinking about, how the comments of the students, at the beginning of the year or middle or end, are really different in terms of what they're thinking about and how they see themselves and their roles was another thing that we were thinking might be interesting to explore.
Yeah, for sure. Patricia might be a good person to pick her brain right now to say, like, as you're going through medical school right now, what do you think would be a good measure, for instance, of, like, Kieran's doing this project where she's looking to see if these informal message boards might be a portal into helping with professional identity formation or emergent needs to see, that this is the only place right now, I think, in the curriculum that she's aware of that has a good Q&A forum where people can ask the burning questions that they've been waiting to ask an attending. It's kind of like Reddit's Ask Me Anything from what I can understand. And so what are some questions that might cue to you as being some research that you might see that being able to, you know, help you understand about yourself or your peers?
Could I just get a little bit of clarification? Is this for like people during their clinical year or kind of like throughout their entire, okay. I guess I'm not sure if this is completely answering the question, but I guess, so I just finished our like first clinical year at my medical school. And I think one of the kind of bigger stressors for people is really like feeling the stress about not knowing what they want to do when they finish up with the clinical year, and like kind of changing last minute or doing what they thought they wanted to do and not really enjoying it that much. And so kind of having any kind of like easy gateway into kind of mentorship for different specialties or something like that would be probably, you know, highly utilized by people. I could see that happening. I'm not sure if that's completely what the question was, but I think that would definitely be something that I guess myself and my peers would have been interested in. So yeah, just like being able to get a better view into what the lifestyle is like and like why people go into this kind of specialty, things like that.
You know, so the faculty for this discussion board, it was just for the emergency medicine rotation.
Okay.
So the faculty would respond to the student posts and pretty quickly within a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the responses had to do with taking whatever particular clinical situation the student was describing, whether it was a, you know, interpersonal interaction or a type of patient case, and kind of connecting it to the big picture about what emergency medicine is all about and what emergency medicine physicians do and how their thought process is maybe different than other fields. And so really trying to sort of use the very specific clinical experiences to sort of draw some larger lessons about what the field is about. The types of patients we see, what our approaches, you know, what our values are, like why we do what we do, you know, all that sort of stuff to help students sort of understand how EM is distinct from some of the other fields. So that comes to mind when you, you know, when you brought up your question. But it's interesting that you brought it up more as related to mentorship, because we haven't really taken that step, and that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, the other way that I can think about this being interesting would be to flip it, right? To flip with your background, you said you do a little bit of faculty development stuff. I can imagine you flipping it to actually study what it means to be a teacher in this asynchronous space. You might actually be able to find other EM clerkships like ours, which allow for that asynchronous stuff as well, to say, how do we do that? Because I think that would be interesting. I think there are a lot of emergency medicine programs and clerkships that have actually integrated some kind of asynchronous chat function. So it might be interesting to interview a whole bunch of different teachers from different centers to say, what would you have needed to be taught to better be a better teacher in this kind of asynchronous world that we are headed into. Yeah, I don't know. That seems to be a very interesting question. That would be I'd be interested in to read that paper or do the study. But
I think it's interesting. You know, do you do something for those faculty who are responding to the students, and then looking at it from the students' perspective of how well did they answer the question, and how well did it really make the student feel engaged and responded to? And you know, because some faculty are really good at this and some faculty are not. They just kind of here's the nuts and bolts and have a nice day. And then there are those who really use it to engage the student and engage thought. like you said, tying it into emergency medicine, helping them see culture and expand their world. You're taking an opportunity and expanding it.
Right. So actually, I just presented this as a oral presentation at the GEA conference last month. And so one of the questions was, how do you train the faculty to respond to student posts? And so we were kind of thinking about that. We hadn't really created a framework for that, but we, along the way thinking about it, we decided that trauma-informed teaching and learning provides a great framework for responding, because a lot of the student posts were really, had a lot of intense emotions, frustration, anger, sadness, like their first time ever witnessing something or doing something. And so just really, really intense emotions. So we talked about that a bit in our presentation. And the other, thing that I wanted to say about, how does this impact the faculty was I found that just engaging with it, that I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself, just as the faculty responding to the post. So I thought that was pretty interesting too.
Yeah, I've done some innovation work on a board game called Gridlocked. And so one of the things that we did was early on, we play tested it with teachers and practicing residents to say how close is this to reality. And they gave us all the list of things that's different, but like, actually it's pretty good this way and blah, blah, blah. So, we published things like that. But then we also went and talked to teachers during that phase to say, what are some teachable moments you can identify, right? So when you're playing this game, how do you actually do that? On the flip side, we then deployed it at a bunch of different workshops with different users, and then we basically came to an understanding that like there need to be more guidance about like how is this different from the health system and things like that. So I think that doing something like that in terms of evaluating what you've done to then spin that around into new curricular innovations can be kind of fun to do. So it might be something worth like looking at, like different lenses and frames, as Sarah Lynn was pointing out. The same phenomenon could be experienced, like that elephant, right? Like from two different point of view. So it might be amazing for you to take a little bit of a step back and say, okay, well, let's just look at the PIF data, right? Let's just look at that and then see how it goes. So, all right. Well, we're going back at the big room, and I gotta present some stuff about program evaluation, and it's great because this group has been really interested in program evaluation. So you primed me already in my brain, but I will see you back in the small groups again when we come back, okay? Okay, so welcome back. All right. Kieran, where are you? Just because I'm
on my patio.
Okay, cool.
At home.
And where do you live? You don't live close to where you work then, I guess.
I live in Nyack in Rockland County. It's just the suburbs of New York City. Yeah, I was in Harlem for the last 9 years, and then just last summer we just moved out after 22 years in Manhattan.
Wow.
So
wow. Is it a big change?
It is a big change. Yeah, it is. But it was the right time. When COVID came, I've got two young kids.
Yeah.
And it was the right time for us to have our own, private outdoor space and just a yard to run around.
That's true. I live in condo right now, and I would say that we went real estate shopping in the middle of the pandemic and bought a house, and I own it now, but I haven't moved yet because of various reasons and efficiencies. But right now, yeah. But I didn't move from the city. I'm still in like my city in Hamilton, Ontario. It's not really a like Manhattan style city. It's more like a Pittsburgh style city.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Manhattan, you know, last April, Manhattan was just too much.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
had to get out.
Yeah, well, we did get out just before CORD because they locked it all down right like days after we left CORD last year, like in 2020. Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, Sarah Lynn is busy, it sounds, for a couple of minutes, and that's totally fine. We all have our parallel lives that we have to go through. So having thought about program evaluation and the different things that we're talking about, I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at the link that Gottlieb sent out. That might be a really good one for you to think about, Kieran, because I do think that reading through the Amy guide and thinking through, are you doing research or are you doing program evaluation? I'm still going to challenge you to think through that.
Yeah.
Because I think that you're waltzing that fine line for sure. And you can decide from study to study which one it will be.
So this is a really good point. And I actually spent a fair amount of time on this question with the people who are working with me on the project from the Center for Teaching and Learning, and with our research director for our department, and with our IRB people. And unfortunately, the IRB people were really not very helpful. What they decided is last year, the bottom line is that I think we've all agreed that it's program evaluation. Which is fine actually, because then the IRB does not do a formal review of it. But you know what's challenging about what Columbia's IRB has done, at least here on the medical campus, is that they put out a 6-page document last year, basically directing people to answer this question for themselves. And
a lot of places do that actually. So your shop is not unique in that way. In fact, the province of Alberta has a unified singleton online tool that people actually use. And it might be inspired by them that they did it, but it's like basically a survey on a website, and you fill out yes, no, and then it basically pops up a question and says print this out. This is your certificate that says it's exempt.
Right. It's like that, except for this is just like a checklist where you don't even have to push any buttons. You just look at the checklist and you just decide. I think that what they actually intend is for each department to have a point person, or like, you know, a little committee who applies this 6-page document to the research that's going on in the department. And so that, you know, that makes sense to me. It was a little problematic for me to apply it to my own research because, you know, I'm biased, right? And I, you know, the sticky question was about, you know, are your findings generalizable? And so we had to, you know, be very, we had to decide that, you know, whatever we learned from this qualitative analysis, we're going to say, you know, it's just what we learned about our students last year, and that's it. You know, it's not anything bigger.
I would say that generally speaking, no qualitative research is ever generalizable. It's transferable maybe, but it's very context bound. So I think by taking a qualitative lens, you're right. What it is that they clearly don't have any qualitative researchers that help write that document because, and also because, I don't know, it's just one of those things where you just have to waltz the line. And the thing is that you made that change regardless, right? So coming back to the ethics of it, regardless of what your institution says you should do, remember that guiding principle that I was talking about. Is this something you would have done regardless? Were you trying to go and see how, did you design this program to see how Patricia and her colleagues would actually understand professional identity? No. Right? You did it because this is the right thing to do. We need to flip to asynchronous. You're creating a portal for people to, and it happens to be that one of the unintended consequences of all the curricular stuff, you're just interested in understanding that phenomenon more.
Right.
Right. And so to me, that is really truly grounded in very rich qualitative program evaluation, but it's not program evaluation.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Does that make sense?
Right.
I
mean,
spent a lot of time on this.
I wanted it to be program evaluation because then I don't have to go through this really cumbersome IRB process.
Fair. I mean, I
Right?
would say that great science, still, regardless of his program evaluation, needs assessment work, or other things that are technically exempt, I try to, as a scientist myself, I try to be as picky as the IRB would have been, set my standards to be just as high, because my work is more publishable in the end. Even if it is not generalizable, people can still kind of like use their my concepts to say, okay, how could I adapt it? I'm not going to do that part because she's clearly told me that I should not send chocolate bars to all the medical students because some of them has diabetes. Like whatever it is that you're doing in your post-COVID world to emulate what you used to do, you know, like, you know, those are the kind of things like you can see that the point of program evaluation, or I call it educational engineering, kind of like reports, because like we're more similar to the engineers who do like technical reports when we do kind of like a program evaluation of an educational project, because you know, like an engineer that does something at GE will publish sometimes their technical report for how they did this light bulb. and then that's because, and it's super contextual to that light bulb, right? But other engineers read that report and go, oh, interesting. That's interesting how they did this part of the light bulb that way. And then they go and innovate and do something else, right? And so the work that we do is more like the little nitty gritty, like light bulb technical report than it is like research. And that has been an uphill climb to convince the world of that nuance. And so I've started kind of communicating it as it's more like an engineering technical report, and thinking about it that way allows people to say, okay, well, that's why I'm so context specific. And it is quite different from research, because in research, we're going to discover this big truth and share it with the world. I'm like, no, you created a product and we just want this.
Why? So what is the motivation or incentive that people have to call their work research? Because I'm very happy to call it program evaluation.
I think it has to do with tenure promotion terminology being outdated. Boyer and Glassick published this stuff in the 1990s. And I'll be honest with you, I think that some TMP programs just haven't gotten with, like, I think Columbia, I know because my colleagues have been through the process there, and some other people, like, they acknowledge scholarship as a thing. And once people flipped over to Boyer's definition of scholarship, those institutions, no one's trying to sell their research, their program evaluation as research. They're just like, I do program evaluation. That's my thing. And then at some shops, so like, where's your, you know, like, where's your research?
Yeah,
and
where's your
like, you
RPT,
mean scholarship? And they're like, no, research. Like, where's your discovery and application driven research? And then people have to phenotype a little bit differently and shoehorn things. It has to do with the tyranny of promotion.
So I guess that just reflects a little bit on my own interests and goals. I'm really not focused on promotion. I'm actually more interested in just developing expertise in this field. If I find that I have any talent at it, I mean, I may just not be any good at it, but getting a master's in health professions education, or even or maybe even a doctorate in education, further down the line, if
Oh, she disappeared. And then she clicked the button. Anyway, all right. Sarah Lynn, any final thoughts? We have 45 seconds. Go for it.
I think one of the challenges you run into with the IRB is that you either fall into the health sciences, having been a chair of IRB, or you're in the social sciences, and education doesn't always quite fit in either pot.
I know, right?
Really well. So it's hard for the health sciences people to understand it, and it's hard for the social sciences people to understand it. And we don't have anyone in the middle to really adjudicate
I would say that
piece.
If you're someone that's that high up, you might want to consider convening a special subcommittee that's a joint task force that actually handles all of those and bring in the expertise you need. That's what
I think that's a great recommendation that we need to move towards. It's just getting the
as a former chair, it'll be easier for you to create that structure than anyone else. I'm just saying you could probably actually be the lead of it and just conflict out when you have your own stuff come across the dashboard. We also I was just, there were some closing thoughts that I thought I'd bring back from my group, if that's okay, Sally, about program evaluation. We had a really good recorded discussion that hopefully others can enjoy later. But there were a couple of things, and there was one question I thought I'd bring up that Kieran asked, and she was in mid-sentence replying to it when we ended, she left our session by accident. So the first question that, thank you, Kieran, for asking this question is, why are people, if program evaluation is different from research, why is it that some people are so obsessed with selling their program evaluation as research? And my answer to that is very practical. I think it's the tyranny of the way that certain promotions and tenure committees have written their wordage, and the way that we do academic reward in certain circles, that research is rewarded but program evaluation is not. So I just be savvy to that. I think more and more institutions are falling in line with the idea of scholarship, in which case program evaluation is definitely one of the buckets of high quality publishable scholarship, but is not always research. And so being able to do the faculty development of your tenure promotion committee to be able to explain that is key. And sometimes writing your content and your letters and your statements and getting your referees when you go up for promotion, for instance, or awards or something like that, to actually acknowledge that is really important. At my shop, we love research. So I position my work actually as research and then knowledge translation of my own research when I do publish a book about some assessment tools that I've researched, et cetera, et cetera. So there are different ways that you can speak about it, understand the signs and symbols of your local institution and go for it. The other thing that was reflected upon, and thank you to Sarah Lynn for raising this, is that sometimes your IRB may lack the interdisciplinary lens to be able to truly understand research and or program evaluation exemptions in education, because they're mainly health sciences and things like that. So a couple of things would be to make sure you try to incept and align it with things like health services research, where it's very clear there's more track record there in understanding, oh, you just started a clinic and then you're evaluating it. That's not research. Well, I think that substitute the word clinic for curriculum, and then people are like, oh, I get it now. Okay. So those are some ways to help with that translation. The other part of it too might be to work with your main campus, if you have a main campus and are affiliated with the university, to bring in some people flipping over the other thing. So all right, so Sally, I think we're moving on to a panel discussion. Is that correct?
Panel, yep, go for it. You're moderating.
I am moderating, so I'm going to, can you remind me who I have to pull up? Because I'm right now looking at all the faces. I think Mike and Susan, I think, are two of the panelists. Is that correct? I'm going to add Spotlight. And
Nicole.
And Nicole, yes, I have to find Nicole.
And the rest of you are welcome to pipe in too.
Yeah. We'll call you up to the stage. We can run it like Clubhouse, where you could put your hand up and then I will pull you up. So if you want to have it, if you're like, I have a burning statement, right? Psycho or a Wolf or other folks that are like, I got this, please let us know and in the chat, and put your hand up in the reactions, and we will go from there. All right. Change of scene. Can I have everyone here introduce themselves? This is the closing panel discussion. So basically, this is the view from the editor's desk, I guess, is maybe what we can call this panel discussion. And I'm really delighted to have three of my esteemed colleagues who I actually edit for at several journals, and would love for them to introduce who they are and their perspective, on peer review will be something we'll dive into further on. But maybe we can start with Susan to tell us a little about who she is with regards to journal editing.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. So my name is Susan Promise, and I am the editor-in-chief for Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training. As I'm sure many of you know, that's kind of the newest journal for education and training and specific to SAM, right? So it's the second journal that SAM started a few years back. It's exciting because all the people that are sitting here are on the editorial board for that journal. So I have an amazing team of people that help with making sure we have top quality manuscripts and scholarship that comes out. So I'll give it back to you, Teresa.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to head over to Mike.
So
Mike Gottlieb. I largely split between ultrasound education, and times they overlap, and other times they split out there. I serve as an editor for AM Education and Training. I'm also an editor for Annals of Emergency Medicine, WestGem, AGEM, and social media editor for Academic AM. And I review for like 35 journals.
Okay, and Nicole, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Nicole DiOrio. I'm the executive editor for the Journal of Graduate Medical Education. A common question is, what does an executive editor do? Journals, every journal has a different structure, but for JGME, I'm sort of the second in command, and I mostly handle papers that are probably going to be accepted, helping with decisions, and really double checking that all the methods are sound, and then doing a lot of technical writing too to get papers ready for publication.
Hey, well, that's definitely different from the other two. So I love that we have an avid reviewer turned editor, we have an editor-in-chief, and we have an executive editor, all whom probably have a different area of interest within the peer review publication cycle. So I'm going to start with actually a general question to all of you, but I'm going to pick on Mike a little bit first, because I want to ask about, why do you review for journals? And I'm going to ask you that because you just self-confessed to review for a lot of journals, and that means you're probably clocking about 50, 100 reviews easily between all your work, both on the editor side and then the reviewer side. But why do you do it? Like, what's in it for you? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I kind of split it into those two pieces. So there's the what's in it for me, and then there's the karmicness of it, right? Like if I'm going to submit a paper, it goes through 3 to 4 reviewers plus 1 to 2, sometimes 3 editors. That's a lot of work on their part. So it feels like I should probably give back the equivalent of that. So I try to aim for roughly 3 peer reviews per paper, which gets a little bit busy, but I feel like it karmically kind of balances out the work I'm asking other people to do. So I think that's kind of the karmic piece, which I think is really big. But the other aspect of it is, how does it help me? I think it forces me to become a better writer. The more I've reviewed, the better my writing style is. I learn different areas. I learn different ways of approaching it. I learn different methodologies. I learn gaps in the field. And it helps me identify, because the more you review, the more you start to realize those pitfalls that the next reviewer is going to be. So I can at least try to preempt as much as I can a reviewer too, by knowing exactly what things will probably get flagged up. So for me, I find that it's actually really enhanced my ability to do studies and my writing style.
All right, great. Thank you for that. I'm going to kick it to Susan now. From your point of view, what are some things that when you are sitting there, before it even goes to someone like Mike as a reviewer, you get the chance to do something called desk rejecting. And so I'm gonna ask you a little bit from your point of view. What are some other things that make it a very easy desk reject for you? Because I know that you pass on like a fair bit of articles to us, and we can sometimes desk reject at AM Education and Training as well. But you have the privilege of seeing all the ones that really don't even get it to an associate level. You just like, no. What are the things that you're looking for when you say no? Or what are the things that are red flags for you that would rule out this paper from proceeding on?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is it interesting? If it's something that's not novel, that it's been published before and people just didn't have the opportunity to look at the literature or didn't know about it, that's easy for me because it's already been published. Another kind of easy thing is someone didn't follow the instructions. Like we have instructions for different categories of manuscripts, and it drives me crazy when people don't follow them. Like, if there's a word count, meet the word count. So that's an easy kind of move on. And then I think there's just flaws, right? We talked at the very beginning of this workshop about kind of finer, when you think about a research question, same kind of thing, right? Just being systematic about how you go about things. And there could be, when I read it, just an obvious flaw that they can't fix. And I'll say no to it. No need to send it out to reviewers for them to pick up on it and then reject it if I can see it right at the beginning. So I'd say those are some of the kind of the hot things. I bet you Nicole and Mike can come up with some others, but those are like right off the top of the bat. Like I don't even have to think very much. It's an easy. It's the ones I struggle with are kind of on the edge. Like, well, maybe this has some renewal. It's a cool idea. It's not perfect, but maybe we should push it along because it's a really good idea and we should get it out there. So,
yeah. Nicole, any thoughts?
Yeah, for me, another big bucket is just fit with the journal. So again, to use an example from JGME, JGME is a journal that goes free to every single program director in APD. So the research has it has to be interesting to program directors and APDs. Otherwise, it's a non-starter. And you'll learn, or you can ask your panel of advisors what different journals are known for and what their target readership is. So be sure you're targeting the right journals with your submission.
Yeah, I was going to say, sometimes I'm an associate editor for academic medicine, and sometimes we get papers that are clearly clinical papers. And I'm like, have you not read this journal before? Definitely read the journal before you submit. You should look at the table of contents at least. Mike?
Yeah, I completely agree with the points that all three of you have made. Running through the finer criteria from a study design standpoint, is it appropriate methodology? Is it sufficient to advance the literature in a reasonable direction? They're not all going to be New England Journal levels, but do they advance the literature and build on existing things? And the other aspect is, right, it's fine with fit. Like, does it fit with your journal? I've had plenty of really good papers that I've desk rejected, not because they weren't good quality, but they were the absolute wrong fit for this. And they may actually fit for a better, higher tier journal. They're just, a study on intubation in the OR is probably not relevant is less relevant to certain EM journals, especially if it's very focused on the anesthetic management. It could be a really good study, but it's not relevant. It's particularly probably not relevant to EM, unless you can kind of pitch there why it ties into us.
So one of the questions that was just asked by Kat, thanks Kat, is what do you think of the Jane semantic identifier, though the journal and author name estimator app? And those of you who don't know what that is, I think she put the link there as well. There you go. They've got it already. What do you think of that as a launching pad when you're not sure where to send it? I mean, you can definitely phone a friend. I think sometimes just DM me on Twitter. I can give you my ballpark, but I mean, like asking your friends, your advisors, people like that. But what do you think of Jane? Has anyone used it before? I often use it just to check to see if I have missed anything. I don't know. Nicole, you're saying?
Oh, I just got fired up about a different point that Mike that Mike was making, which is that it has to do with like fit and resubmitting. Like the germ of the idea might be relevant to many different journals, but don't just, when you get rejected from one, turn around and send the same paper to another one, like right to the author, right to the readership. Right. So maybe there is some translatability about this OR simulation that is important for emergency medicine to read, but you really have to make the case for it in the introduction and the discussion.
Right. All right. Let's fast forward to the process. When you're an editor, how do you take, you've got these reviews sitting in front of you, and now you're making a decision. What are some things that, when we're writing reviews to all three of you, what are some things that you really wish the reviewers did? Because I'm hoping more people here, after Mike's self-confession about how it's helpful for him, might be interested in reviewing. And so if for all of our prospective reviewers, what do you think could be some things that people could do in their reviews to be helpful? Maybe one thing per person. We'll start with Susan.
Yeah, I would say when you do a review, don't give us a rehash of the manuscript, right? We can read the manuscript. Tell us what you think. Like, this was an excellent manuscript that I think would add to the literature on X, Y, and Z. I would recommend publishing it with a couple modifications and then go through whatever it is. Or, I think it has a fatal flaw and I recommend not publishing it. And say it in a nice way, obviously, but I think that's really important. Cut to the chase, tell us what you think, and then you can go on from there. That would be my number one thing.
All right, Nicole, to you.
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to say your opinion. It's kind of an extension of what Susan said, because we chose you as reviewers for this particular paper because you're going to bring an interesting lens or area of expertise that like we don't have. So we really need to rely on you and your understanding of the literature, or your position as XYZ person potentially using this research. So try not to have imposter syndrome if you're a new reviewer. We really need that lens that you're bringing.
Okay, and Mike.
I think those are all really great points. And one of the things I always try to do is at the end, right before you hit the submit button, just step back and try to approach it from the lens of the reader, or not the reader, but the author, both to ensure that, you know, some of the comments we write when we're being critical could be written a little bit nicer because they put a lot of time into that. So kind of just imagine there's another person at the other end of it and how you could frame it. But also sometimes we write things that are a little more ambiguous than we intend them to be. And so, you know, this is confusing. It's not as helpful as saying this would be better phrased as, or maybe consider this lens. So I think the more that you can kind of step back and just put ourselves in the author's feet for just a moment, will make it a little bit higher quality review and a little bit more tangible for them to make improvements on.
Yeah, I always suggest to reviewers that are starting out, read it as if you were sending it to a friend that you actually really care about, and they've asked you for your opinion, or a resident that you didn't want to pick on. The other part would be, you know, take all those skills you learn from simulation debriefing, all those skills that you have from clinical supervision and direct observation feedback sessions, and use the same skills, and be specific, be measurable, like do all the things that we're supposed to do when you were giving feedback about the central line placement and communication skills at the bedside. Try to generalize your skills over that way. We have another question here. Do we give feedback to reviewers? And I believe, Susan, do you want to give a shout out to the reviewer workshop that's happening this week, maybe?
Yeah. So, you know, AEM ENT does have a reviewer workshop this week. You guys can all check it out on the website for the meeting. And you know, all the reviewers, at least for AEM ENT, get a score of 1 to 4. And we've been starting to send some of that back to people so they can kind of see how they compare to other reviewers on their manuscripts.
And some journals, I know JGME has like a list they publish to thank reviewers, but they do pick out people who are star reviewers. So you sometimes get feedback that way too. So not just you got a 1 out of 4, but sometimes there are journals that give awards and stuff. So that's kind of nice. The other thing that can be useful as well is actually just sending an email back to Steve and say, hey, Steve, Mike, Susan, Nicole, these are editors, Meg, right? Like, ask them. Just, we're a small community in EM. We're all trying to help each other up our game. And if you just say, what'd you think of that review? I wasn't sure, right? And then Mike will tell me what it is. And then that's not just because he's Mike and he's awesome, but generally speaking, most decision editors at Susan's journal, at least, AEM education and training, to plug it a little bit, would be that you can write to us and ask us to give you feedback. Sometimes if you get me, sometimes I'll even say, do you want to Zoom, and we'll just go over the whole thing. And that's not necessarily to say it's a bad thing, just gives you more chance of one-on-one to have some conversation.
Yeah, if people are interested in being reviewers, feel free to reach out. We're always looking for people to review for AEM ENT, and I'm sure other journals are looking as well. So I encourage you, you know, do it, or match up with someone that is a reviewer and say, hey, can I look at a paper with you and kind of go through it? We're always looking for people.
Okay, on the last question now, we're going to go rapid fire, is when you get reviews back, what's one thing you wish every author knew about the revision process and how to optimize it for you as a decision editor?
You know, I think it's very basic. Address each of the issues. You don't always have to do everything that's asked of you, but give a reason why you don't think you should do it. Don't avoid it. You know, hit it head on so we know where you're coming from.
All right, Mike. Nicole, go for it.
I was just gonna say, and if you have any questions, it is fine to reach out and ask. We're all just normal people. We're accessible. If it happened to like cross some kind of boundary of the peer review process, we would be happy to tell you that, but 95% of the time, it's fine to just reach out outside of the formal back and forth to ask for clarification.
Mike?
I think those are such big key points. I'm gonna just add on to it, and that just remember that editors are all down to earth and they're all super accessible. And if you reach out with a question or you don't agree with a reviewer comment, sometimes it's faster to just reach out to them and say, I don't think I could do this, and here's why. Is often a little easier and faster on both parties than trying to submit a response and then going through the cycle multiple times. And it's okay not to incorporate it as long as it's said that you're just explaining why you can't or don't believe it's the best decision.
Okay, yeah, and my final thought that I'm just going to take chair's prerogative to add is honestly, just make sure that you're nice there too, right? Because the editors and the reviewers, although sometimes they don't see your reviews back, I would say that unprofessionalism is a red flag. And if you're like snarky or snippy or dismissive in your reviews, it might not be at every journal, but at some journals that is not seen favorably, and therefore could be grounds for people to actually reject your paper, even though it's amazing paper. And so just be careful of that. That is like code of conduct issues, or like, don't use swearing words, don't be too patronizing, like respond very cordially. Imagine your chair wrote the review, and just handle it that way, because I think that if you do it that way with respect, then it's good for the whole community. So, all right, and we're gonna invite Sally back up for closing thoughts, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks everybody for being engaged and involved. There is an evaluation. If you click on it either in the chat or Steve is putting a QR code, we would appreciate it so that we can help to improve. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our panel. And it sounded like Teresa was going to post things on the website where the Google Docs were. So if you want kind of resources, we'll put those there, as well as there were some within the materials that we gave as well. So great. Thanks everybody. And thanks all of our instructors for helping us with this. This is a great session. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.